Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Now settle in, because what is about to unfold is not a movie. It is not a thriller novel sitting on your nightstand. Every single detail in this story happened in real life, in real time, to real people. People who went to work, who cooked dinner, who kissed their children goodnight, and never imagined that somewhere in the darkest corner of the internet, someone had already paid for them to die. This story begins with an email. It arrives on an ordinary afternoon in late June of 2018. The subject line reads, simply, suicide or murder? That question mark at the end is doing a lot of work. It is not casual punctuation. It is a trembling hand on a door that, once opened, cannot be closed again. The email contains a link. When the link is clicked, it opens to a web page, a record, a transaction, a digital receipt for a life. It is a screenshot of a conversation between a person calling themselves Toon Bib and a website that claims to be run by the Albanian mafia. The conversation is chilling in its ordinariness. Toon Bib uploads a photo. The photo is of a young man in a suit, the kind of photo you take for a yearbook, the kind of photo a mother keeps on her mantelpiece. The young man's name is Brian Njoric. He is 21 years old. He is a soldier in the United States Army. He is stationed at Fort Knox in Kentucky. And according to the messages on that webpage, someone has paid approximately $5,500 in Bitcoin to have him killed. The dates in the conversation are precise. Toon Bib informs the website that Brian will only be at a specific location, an Airbnb address in Indiana, from June 1st through June 11th of 2018. 10 days. A 10-day window in which someone believed a hired killer would walk through a door and end Brian Njoric's life. On the morning of June 9th, 2018, Brian Njoric is found dead on a baseball field in Clarksville, Indiana. He is lying face down beneath the stairs of an announcer's box. The coroner determines quickly that he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun had been stolen earlier that same day from a shooting range called American Shooters, located in the town's northwest. The case is closed within days. Police rule it a suicide. And that, officially, is the end of the story. Except it is not. Because someone knew where Brian would be. Someone knew the specific Airbnb he would stay at. Someone knew the precise dates of his visit to Indiana. And the money, $5,500 in Bitcoin, had already been sent. The hitman, of course, was never real. But the intent behind the order absolutely was. And the young man who was supposed to be alive on June 12th was not. His father, Samuel Njoric, would later say that the police never mentioned the assassination website to him when they spoke about his son's death. He would go on to raise uncomfortable questions about inconsistencies between the case report and the autopsy, about the fact that the fatal bullet was never recovered, about the disappearance of Brian's personal devices. Brian was, by all accounts, inseparable from his phone, his camera, his laptop. He was a small-time social media personality, building a YouTube and Instagram presence, the kind of young man who documented everything. And yet after his death, his computer, his camera, and both of his phones were never found. Then there was the life insurance policy. Brian Njoric had a $400,000 policy. Just 1 month before his death, he had changed the beneficiary. He removed his parents from the document and designated a female friend in their place. His father did not know this woman well. He did not know whether she had been traveling with Brian or had known about the trip to Indiana. The official verdict remained unchanged. Suicide. Case closed. But halfway around the world, in a small apartment in London, England, a man named Chris Montero was reading the very same email. And Chris Montero was not going to let it go. To understand what Chris Montero was doing that day, and why a man in London would receive an anonymous email about the death of a young soldier in Indiana, you have to understand the world that Chris Montero had spent years navigating. You have to go somewhere most people will never go. Not because they cannot, but because they do not know it exists, or because knowing it exists is enough to keep them away. You have to go to the dark web. Most people understand the internet as the thing they use every single day. They open a browser, They type in a search, they find what they are looking for. That version of the internet, the websites indexed by Google, the social media platforms, the shopping sites, the news, is sometimes called the surface web. It is visible. It is searchable. It is, for the most part, regulated. Beneath that surface web is something else. Technically, it is called the deep web, a vast collection of pages and databases that do not appear in standard search results. Your bank account information lives there. Medical records live there. Private government databases live there. None of that is sinister. It is simply information that is not meant to be publicly searchable. But within the deep web, there is a smaller, more deliberately hidden layer. It is called the dark web. To access it, a person needs a special browser called Tor, short for the Onion Router, which was originally developed by the United States Navy for secure communications. When someone uses Tor, their internet traffic is encrypted and bounced through a series of servers around the world before it reaches its destination, making it extraordinarily difficult to trace. Websites on the dark web have addresses that end in .onion rather than .com or .org, and they cannot be found through any regular search engine. They do not want to be found. They are built for people who do not want to be seen. The dark web is not entirely a den of criminality. Journalists in repressive countries use it. Whistleblowers use it. Political dissidents use it. But it is also the home of drug marketplaces, stolen financial data, illegal pornography, counterfeit documents, and, the subject of this story, murder-for-hire websites. The idea of hiring an assassin online sounds like the plot of a bad movie. Most reasonable people, upon hearing it, would assume it is either a joke or a myth. And that is precisely what Chris Montero believed when he first encountered such websites in 2015. He was working by day as a systems administrator for a mid-sized firm in London, managing IT security. But his nights were different. His nights belonged to a different version of himself, a white-hat hacker and independent cybercrime researcher who spent hours navigating the dark web, documenting its ecosystems, debunking its myths. He had 6 computer monitors in his flat. 6. On any given evening, he would be bathed in their glow, moving through dark web forums and marketplaces like a scientist moving through a laboratory, cataloging what he found. And what he found, over and over, was fake hitman websites. Sites that claimed to connect willing clients with professional killers in exchange for Bitcoin. Sites with names designed to sound dangerous and organized. Names that invoked criminal syndicates, ancient brotherhoods, underworld networks. Sites with menus of violence available for purchase. Broken English, stock photos of men in balaclavas, pricing structures that shifted constantly, excuse after excuse for why no job had yet been completed. Chris Montero recognized them immediately for what they were. Scams. Pure and simple. The dark web hitman for hire marketplace, he concluded, was a myth, a fantasy that certain desperate or deranged individuals had convinced themselves was real. In early 2016, he wrote a carefully sourced article for Rational Wiki, a site dedicated to debunking myths and pseudoscience, explaining in plain terms that all hitman for hire websites on the dark web were fraudulent. He laid out the evidence clearly. He was thorough. He was confident. He pressed publish. And then, a few days later, his article was vandalized. An anonymous user had edited the page. The edit was clumsy and grammatically awkward, but its message was unmistakable. It read, in paraphrase, that while other dark web hitman sites were indeed scams, there was one that was different. One that was real. One that had protections in place for clients, including an escrow system that held Bitcoin until the job was done. That site was called Besa Mafia. Chris Montero looked at the edit and felt something between irritation and curiosity. He traced the IP address of the edit to Romania. He deleted the vandalism. He clicked the link that had been left in the edit, and the rabbit hole opened beneath him. The Besa Mafia website looked, at first glance, like someone had tried to build a professional criminal enterprise on the dark web and mostly succeeded. It had a cleaner layout than most of the hitman scam sites Montero had encountered. There was branding, a dark, moody aesthetic that evoked organized crime, the kind of visual language borrowed from mafia movies and crime dramas. There was a messaging system built in that allowed clients to communicate directly with the site's administrators. There was a section where aspiring hitmen could register themselves, listing their skills, whether they could shoot with a pistol or a sniper rifle, whether they had military training, whether they were available in a particular city or region. There was even a front page that stated, with no apparent embarrassment whatsoever, "If you want to kill someone, or to beat the shit out of him, we are the right guys. We have professional hitmen available through the entire USA, Canada, and Europe, and you can hire a contract killer easily." Montero read through the site carefully. He looked at the photos, stock images, clearly pulled from Google searches, of shadowy figures in dark clothing. He read the copy, poor English, geographic errors, the kind of vague promises that never pinned down to anything specific. He checked the site's architecture and noted the inconsistencies. He concluded, quickly and with certainty, that this was exactly what the others were. A scam. A well-dressed scam, perhaps slightly more polished than the rest, but a scam nonetheless. No professional criminal organization, Albanian or otherwise, was operating an assassination marketplace on the Tor network. The whole premise was absurd. He wrote up his findings in a blog post on his personal site, pirate.london, where he had been publishing dark web research for over a year. He cataloged the frauds and the flaws. He explained exactly why the site was fake. He pressed publish and moved on to the next thing. And that is when Euro appeared. Within days of the blog post going live, a message arrived in Montero's inbox. The sender identified himself as the administrator of Besa Mafia. He did not give a real name. He simply called himself Euro. In his first message, Euro was not angry. He was something more calculated than angry. He was persuasive. He wrote that Montero's article was damaging his business, and asked if there was any possibility that Montero might consider writing a true and honest positive review of the site instead. He offered compensation. He offered money. He seemed genuinely puzzled that someone was not immediately open to being paid to reverse their position. Montero said no. There was nothing honest about saying a scam was real, and he was not about to put his name on a lie, regardless of the price. The exchange that followed was strange and prolonged. Euro kept coming back. He argued that the site was legitimate. He offered what he claimed was evidence. Montero picked every piece of that evidence apart. Euro countered. Montero countered back. They went back and forth for weeks, this odd, asymmetrical argument between a London-based IT researcher and an anonymous administrator of a dark web murder site. And somewhere in those exchanges, something shifted. Euro stopped asking nicely. A few weeks into the ongoing dispute, Euro sent a link. The link led to a YouTube video. Montero clicked it. On his screen, he watched as a hooded figure stood on a street at night, holding up a piece of paper. Written on the paper was Montero's blog domain, pirate.london. Then the camera panned to a car. The car was on fire. Fully engulfed, orange and black, heat rippling the air around it. The video was brief. It was silent apart from the crackling of flames. It was dedicated, in its own wordless way, to Chris Montero, a message as clear as any that has ever been sent between two people who have never met. Montero sat with that video for a while. He would later admit, frightened. He called a lawyer the next morning. He began documenting everything. Every message from Euro, every threat, every attempt at manipulation. He also began doing something else. He began looking more closely at Besa Mafia. Not just at the surface of the site, but at its structure, at its code, at the vulnerabilities in its architecture. Because Chris Montero was not a man who frightened easily, and he was not a man who walked away from things. The messaging system on the Besa Mafia website contained a vulnerability. It was not a sophisticated vulnerability. It was the kind of basic security oversight that an experienced IT professional could identify relatively quickly. The system used sequential message IDs. That meant that if you knew the ID of one message, you could, with enough patience and the right approach, manipulate the system to display other messages. Messages that were not meant to be visible to you. Montero saw the vulnerability. He began building a system to exploit it. Methodically and carefully, working through the night on those 6 monitors in his London flat, he began pulling messages out of the Besa Mafia database. Not just a few messages. All of them. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at his screens for a long time. The clients were real. That was the thing that unmade everything he had assumed. He had gone in expecting to find a handful of bored trolls, maybe some deeply troubled individuals playing out a fantasy, sending fake orders to a fake site as a way of feeling dangerous from the safety of their keyboards. What he found instead was something much worse. The site had received hundreds upon hundreds of genuine orders. Genuine in the sense that real people had sent real money, real Bitcoin, untraceable, irreversible, for the specific purpose of having specific named individuals killed. There were names. There were addresses. There were photographs, surveillance-style photos and yearbook photos and photos pulled from social media. There were instructions about daily routines, about working hours, about when a target would be alone. There were requests for particular methods. Some clients wanted it to look like an accident. Some clients wanted it to look like a robbery gone wrong. Some clients were very specific about wanting the target to suffer before they died. The orders had come from everywhere, from across the United States, from Europe, from Asia, from the Middle East. The targets were, overwhelmingly, people in the client's own lives. Spouses, partners, ex-lovers, business rivals, a neighbor in a long-running dispute, an employer who had fired someone, a colleague who had gotten the promotion someone else had wanted. Ordinary grievances, the mundane accumulation of resentment and bitterness that sits inside most people but never becomes anything more than that. Never becomes something you act on, something you pay for. And yet here, in this database that was not supposed to exist, were hundreds of people who had crossed that line. One message stood out in particular, not for its violence, but for its sheer pettiness. A man had paid several $1,000s in Bitcoin because he had lost money on a sports betting website and the customer service representative had failed to process his refund. He wanted that customer service representative, a complete stranger who had simply done their job poorly on one occasion, dead. Montero read that one twice. He read another order from a user who identified as being in New Jersey. The user wrote on May 7, 2016, that he needed a handgun with ammunition because he could not legally obtain one himself. He then mentioned, almost as an aside, that if a gun was unavailable, he was considering a hit order instead. The target, he wrote, was 14 years old. 14. He asked if that was an acceptable age. Yura had replied without hesitation. Yes, 14 was acceptable, and the price would be $18,500. The order had been placed. Nearly $19,000 in Bitcoin to have a 14-year-old child killed. Somewhere in New Jersey, that child was walking around with a price on their head and had no idea. Montero went quiet for a while after reading that one. He would later say that he thought he had grown numb to the material. He was wrong. He now had a decision to make. He had obtained this information illegally, a fact he was entirely aware of. He had hacked a website. The data was not his. Taking it to the police was complicated, because the data had been obtained through methods that law enforcement in many jurisdictions would not be able to use in court. The UK's National Crime Agency had already made clear their reluctance to work with illegally obtained information. The FBI, to whom Montero had attempted to report several cases, had redirected him. He was a British citizen, and the jurisdictional lines kept getting in the way. But the names in the database were real. The addresses were real. The people listed as targets were going about their ordinary lives with no idea that someone they knew, a husband, a wife, a business partner, an ex, had already paid to have them murdered. What was Chris Montero supposed to do with that? There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with knowing something that you cannot easily tell anyone. Montero had that loneliness in abundance now. He had been sitting with this database for weeks, reading through messages that ranged from the banal to the horrifying, and the weight of it was pressing down on him in ways he had not anticipated. He had started this as an intellectual exercise, a researcher debunking a scam, a white-hat hacker poking at a fraudulent website. He had not signed up to be the only person standing between hundreds of potential victims and the people who wanted them dead. But here he was. He reached out to a partner in his investigations, a cybersecurity professional he knew only by their online alias, Judge Judy. Judge Judy was someone Montero trusted in the particular way that people who operate in the shadow spaces of the internet trust each other, through shared work, shared risk, and shared commitment to a set of informal principles about what is and is not acceptable in the world. Together, Montero and Judge Judy developed a plan. They would not just extract the data from the Besa Mafia site. They would take the site down entirely. They would break it. They would walk through its front door, disable its systems, and leave something in its place. A message, a declaration, a statement that would be impossible to miss. The hack itself was meticulous. Montero and Judge Judy worked through the site's vulnerabilities, not just the messaging system, but deeper into the infrastructure. They moved carefully, leaving as few traces as possible, pulling as much data as they could before the kill switch. When it was done, the Besa Mafia website was replaced with a single message. The message informed anyone who visited the site that it was over. It stated, bluntly, that no one had ever actually been killed through Besa Mafia. It was over. The site was gone. For about 24 hours, Montero felt something that might have been satisfaction. Then Yura built a new site. It went up almost immediately, a rebranded version of the same operation, with a different name, different design, same system. Yura had not missed a beat. He had expected the takedown, or something like it, and had prepared accordingly. The new site accepted new orders. New clients arrived. The kill list started filling up again. Montero looked at his screens and understood, with a clarity that settled in his chest like a stone, that this was not going to be a single battle. This was going to be a war. A slow, grinding, largely invisible war between one man in a London flat and a faceless operator who called himself Yura and who seemed, by all evidence, to be completely unbothered by the concept of consequences. And Yura was clever. He kept rebranding. Sicilian Hitmen, Azerbaijani Eagles, Camorra Hitmen, Crime Bay, Cosa Nostra. Each time one iteration was damaged or disrupted, a new one appeared. Each new site had the same architecture underneath, same basic messaging system, same approach, same broken English from someone who was clearly not Italian or Albanian or Sicilian, but was committed to the performance regardless. And each new site began collecting new clients almost immediately, because the demand, it turned out, was not going anywhere. People kept arriving. People kept handing over their Bitcoin. People kept uploading photographs and addresses and schedules and instructions about how they wanted someone to die. Montero kept watching. He kept building automated systems to scrape and document the orders. He set up Google alerts for every name on the kill list, so that if anything happened to any of those people, a news story, a death notice, a police report, he would know about it. He was trying to be a system. He was trying to compensate, with technology and vigilance, for the absence of any formal institution willing to do what he was doing. In the meantime, Yura had not forgotten about him. The campaign against Chris Montero escalated steadily through 2016 and into 2017. Yura, or someone working for him, began hiring people to build a false internet reputation for Montero. Blog posts appeared, sloppily written, anonymously published, claiming that Chris Montero was not a researcher exposing Besa Mafia. He was, according to these posts, actually the one running Besa Mafia. He was the administrator. He was the one collecting money for murder. The posts were crude, but not entirely without strategic thought. They were built to appear in search results when someone Googled Montero's name. They were designed to muddy the waters so thoroughly that any legitimate report Montero made to law enforcement would be viewed with suspicion. If a police officer Googled this researcher and found a dozen pages claiming he was himself a criminal operator, how seriously would they take his tips? Yura also hired someone in India, a freelance internet marketer named Santosh Sharma, to run the SEO and advertising operation for the murder sites. Sharma, who would later be located and questioned by CBS News journalists, claimed to have had no idea what he was actually promoting. He said he had just been hired to drive traffic to websites and had not asked too many questions about the nature of those websites. He admitted to having created several front pages, including besa-mafia.com, as part of the marketing campaign. He said Yura still owed him about $400. Santosh Sharma was released without charges. Then came February 2017. Montero was at home in his London flat, eating pumpkin soup. It was an evening like many others. Monitors glowing, the hum of equipment, the quiet work of navigating dark corners of the internet. Then something very different happened. A battering ram hit his front door. The door came off its hinges. Armed police officers came through. They grabbed Montero, handcuffed him, and placed him face down on the floor of his own apartment. They searched everything, every drive, every device, every corner of the flat. Then they put him in the back of a police van and drove him away. In the custody suite, a National Crime Agency officer told Montero that he was under arrest. The charge, running Besa Mafia. Yura's false blog posts had worked. Someone in law enforcement, or connected to law enforcement, or filing a complaint that law enforcement had acted on, had fed the NCA a narrative in which Chris Montero was not a researcher trying to expose a dark web murder site, but was actually the person running it. The man who had spent more than a year trying to draw attention to the threat this site posed had been arrested for being the threat itself. Montero spent 2 days and 2 nights in custody, 2 days in a cell, knowing exactly what had happened, unable to do much about it. He would later say that the experience was surreal in a way that went beyond ordinary fear. It was the specific surreality of being accused of the thing you had been fighting against, of finding yourself on the wrong side of the very institution you had been trying to work with. Eventually, the NCA looked more carefully at the evidence, or the lack of it. They compared what they had with what Montero had been publishing publicly for over a year. They released him. No charges were filed. He walked out of custody, went home to his apartment with its broken door, and sat down at his monitors. And he kept going. Because that is the thing about Chris Montero that makes this story something other than simply a cautionary tale about cybercrime. He kept going. After the threats, after the burning car video, after the false blogs, after the arrest, he had every reason in the world to close his laptops, delete his files, and go back to being just an IT manager in London. Nobody was paying him for this work. Nobody had asked him to do it. Nobody, for the longest time, was even particularly grateful for it. Law enforcement had proven themselves either unwilling or structurally unable to work with the information he was providing. He was one man, working on 6 monitors, against a sprawling, faceless, constantly rebranding criminal operation that had thousands of clients, and an operator who seemed almost to enjoy the game. He kept going anyway. And while he was keeping going, Amy Allwine was still alive. She would not be for much longer. But for a little while longer, she was. Amy Allwine lived in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. She was, by all accounts, a warm and caring woman. She attended church regularly. She was active in her community. She was married to a man named Stephen Allwine. Stephen was a deacon in the church they attended together. He was, to the outside world, a pillar of the community, a man of faith, a family man, a responsible member of a suburban congregation in the American Midwest. He and Amy had a young son together. What the outside world did not know was that somewhere behind that carefully maintained facade, Stephen Allwine had been spending time on the dark web. He had found Besa Mafia, and in February of 2016, he had sent a message. He was using the username DogDayGod. His message opened with words that were stripped of all pretense. "I need this bitch dead. So please help me." He wanted Amy Allwine dead. He wanted it to look like a car accident. Besa Mafia quoted him a price of $6,000. He began paying. The amounts increased over time, as Ura's operation always did. More money needed. The hitman had been delayed. There had been a complication. A different hitman was being assigned. By the time the payments were done, DogDayGod had paid more than $12,000 in Bitcoin for the murder of his wife. Amy Allwine had made, as far as anyone who knew her could determine, no enemies. She was the kind of person about whom people used words like kind and generous without any particular effort or thought, because those words were simply accurate. She volunteered. She helped neighbors. She was, in the parlance of her community, a good woman. And somewhere in the private architecture of her marriage, invisible to everyone around her, her husband had decided that she needed to stop existing. The specific reasons Stephen Allwine wanted Amy dead would emerge gradually through the investigation and trial that followed her killing. Stephen had been living a double life. He had a secret online life that stood in stark contrast to his role as a church deacon, one that included activity on adult websites, financial pressures, and a growing desire to be free of his marriage without the complications of divorce. He was not the first person in history to decide that murder was cleaner than alimony. He was not even the first person in history to attempt outsourcing that murder to an anonymous online service. But he was among the first to do so through a dark web platform that was actively being monitored by a cybercrime researcher in London, whose automated systems were recording every single message that passed through the Besa Mafia server. When the FBI first became aware of the Besa Mafia database, partly through Montero's efforts and partly through their own investigations into dark web activity, they began reviewing the kill orders in the system. They were looking at dozens of cases, potential victims all across the United States and beyond. But the case of DogDayGod targeting Amy Allwine was among the most urgent. The orders were detailed. The urgency was explicit. Dogdaygod had noted in his messages that he wanted this done as soon as possible. He had referenced a specific upcoming trip Amy would be taking to Moline, Illinois, asking whether the hit could be carried out there. On May 31st, 2016, 2 FBI agents and a Cottage Grove police detective showed up at the Allwine residence. They sat Amy and Stephen down together in the same room, and they explained what they had found. Someone, they said, had paid a dark web hitman site more than $12,000 to have Amy killed. The username was Dogdaygod. The FBI did not know who Dogdaygod was, not yet. They warned Amy. They advised her to install new security measures. They spoke with both her and her husband in the same room, at the same time, and then they left. Stephen Allwine sat in that room and listened to federal agents describe the murder plot that he himself had commissioned. He sat next to his wife while she expressed shock and confusion about who could possibly want her dead. He showed her the face that a deacon of a church is required by the architecture of his own deception to show in that moment: concern, support, bewilderment. And then the agents left, and Stephen and Amy were alone in their house in Cottage Grove, and Amy added a security alarm to the house, because the FBI had told her to be careful. In the weeks that followed, Amy received anonymous emails encouraging her to commit suicide. One of them read, "Commit suicide. If you do not, then you will slowly see things taken away from you, and each time you will know that you could have stopped it, which will eat you apart from the inside." Amy did not know who was sending them. The email address was anonymous. She was living with the knowledge that someone wanted her dead, dealing with the psychological weight of that knowledge, while the person sending those emails was sleeping in the same bed. Stephen Allwine had understood, by this point, that Besa Mafia was not going to deliver what he had paid for. The site had already been exposed and partially shut down by Montero's hacks. The FBI's visit had made clear that the transaction was compromised. He needed a different approach. He went back to the dark web, this time to a marketplace called Dream Market, and he searched for scopolamine. It is a drug with legitimate medical uses, but a disturbing parallel history. In large doses, it disorients a person completely, robbing them of the ability to form clear memories or exercise free will. It is odorless. It is tasteless. It dissolves in liquid. On the street, it is sometimes called devil's breath. Stephen Allwine ordered it and waited for it to arrive. The next month, Stephen bought a handgun through legal channels. On November 13th, 2016, Amy Allwine was not feeling well. She had been complaining throughout the day of feeling faint and dizzy. At some point during that day, she had searched the internet for vertigo, Wikipedia, presumably trying to understand what was happening to her body. The scopolamine was doing what Stephen had intended it to do, disorienting her, making her vulnerable, making her unsuspecting. Late that night, Stephen Allwine shot his wife in the head. He staged the scene to look like a suicide. He placed the gun near her body. He had removed enough evidence that he believed he had created a convincing picture. He had not. During the forensic examination of Stephen's digital devices after his wife's death, investigators found something. It was a deleted backup file, the kind of file that most people assume is gone forever once they delete it, the kind of file that a forensic expert can often resurrect. The file contained a specific Bitcoin wallet address. It was the exact same Bitcoin wallet address that Dogdaygod had used to send payments to Besa Mafia. The same wallet. The same address. The digital thread that connected Stephen Allwine, church-going deacon of Cottage Grove, Minnesota, to the anonymous dark web user Dogdaygod, who had written, "I need this bitch dead." He was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder. In January of 2018, Stephen Allwine was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has never expressed remorse in any public forum. He maintained, through the proceedings, an opacity that those who knew him found both bewildering and familiar. It was, after all, the same opacity that had hidden his double life for years. Amy's family was devastated by her death. They were also devastated by the way the investigation had unfolded. They argued publicly that the FBI had made a catastrophic error by interviewing Amy and Stephen together when they first arrived at the house. Statistically, the majority of violent crimes committed against women are carried out by intimate partners. To sit a potential victim and her potential killer in the same room, tell them both that someone had paid for a murder, and then leave. This was, Amy's family argued, a failure that contributed directly to her death. If Stephen had been questioned separately, if the FBI had looked more carefully at who Dogdaygod might be, if the Bitcoin trail had been followed sooner, Amy might still be alive. The FBI neither confirmed nor denied the specifics of the investigation's timeline. The case went to trial. The verdict was the verdict. And Amy Allwine, who had made no enemies, who had lived a life of quiet generosity and community service, was buried in Minnesota while her husband was processed into the prison system where he will spend the remainder of his natural life. Chris Montero watched all of this from London. He had been the one whose automated systems had captured the messages between Dogdaygod and Yura. He had passed that information to law enforcement. And Amy had still died. He thought about that for a long time. He is still thinking about it. The question that the Amy Allwine case forced into the open is one that does not resolve neatly. If the FBI had acted more aggressively on the information that Montero provided, could her death have been prevented? If the warning visit had been different, if Stephen had been separated from Amy, if the wallet address had been traced immediately, if a search warrant had been obtained that same day, would Amy Allwine be alive? There is no answer. There is only the case report, the trial transcript, and a grave in Minnesota. What the case did do, clearly and unmistakably, was demonstrate something that Montero had been trying to communicate for over a year. The Hitman website was fake. No professional assassin had ever been hired. No murder had ever been carried out by anyone connected to Besa Mafia. But the clients were real. The money was real. The intent was real. And when the fake mechanism failed to deliver what the client had paid for, the client, in at least one case, simply did it themselves. The website had not killed Amy Allwine, but the website had served as the crucible in which Stephen Allwine's intent had hardened into action. It had given him a framework, a sense of process, a set of steps to follow. When those steps failed, the intent that had been forged in them did not disappear. It found another path. If you've passed the barrier of having paid money to get someone killed, Montero told a journalist, you are mentally committed to doing that. That was the thing. That was the terrible, unglamorous truth at the center of all of this. The website was fake, but it did not create fake killers. It found real ones. The Allwine case had cracked something open, not just in terms of the legal consequences for Stephen, but in terms of how the world at large began to understand what Besa Mafia actually was. Before Amy died, the story had been largely contained to cybercrime circles. The people following it were researchers, dark web enthusiasts, a handful of journalists who covered digital crime. After Amy died, the story became something else. It became a murder case with a dark web component, the kind of story that gets covered by local news, and then national news, and then ends up in the files of federal prosecutors who start looking at it from a different angle. The FBI, which had previously handled the dark web element of the Allwine case with what Amy's family characterized as insufficient urgency, now had a concrete murder conviction that had been facilitated, at least in part, by activity on Besa Mafia. That changed the calculus. It made the kill list not just a theoretical concern, but a documented criminal record. And it gave prosecutors a legal framework for treating an order placed on a dark web scam site as a genuine criminal act. Because if someone paid money with the genuine intent to have another person killed, the fact that the hitman was fictional did not eliminate the criminality of the intent. This was a legal gray area that law enforcement had been sitting with uncomfortably. Courts in various jurisdictions were beginning to grapple with the question. If a murder-for-hire website is a scam and nobody was ever actually going to carry out the killing, can the person who paid still be prosecuted for attempted murder or conspiracy to commit murder? The answer, in most U.S. jurisdictions, was coming back as yes. Intent mattered. Payment mattered. The act of uploading a photograph, submitting an address, and transferring Bitcoin for the explicit purpose of arranging someone's death was, in the eyes of an increasing number of prosecutors, a crime, regardless of whether any killer existed on the other end. That meant that the kill list was not just a moral emergency. It was a prosecutorial opportunity. Montero had been sitting on this list for over a year, trying to get someone, anyone, to take it seriously. Now, finally, people were beginning to take it seriously. But the machinery of law enforcement is slow. It moves through jurisdictions and warrants and evidentiary standards and interagency communications. While that machinery was slowly warming up, Euro was moving fast. He always moved fast. By 2017, the operation that had started as Besa Mafia had already cycled through several rebrands and was operating under new names. The architecture was the same. The administrator was the same. The broken English was the same. But the name was different, and that difference was often enough to confuse investigators who were tracking the original site rather than the pattern beneath it. New clients poured in every week. New names appeared on the kill list. New photographs were uploaded. New addresses were submitted. Montero maintained his automated monitoring systems through all of it. He set up alerts for every name on the list. He built tools that tracked changes in the sites and captured data before it could be deleted. He documented everything with a methodical obsession that his friends and colleagues found both admirable and concerning. This was not a hobby anymore. It was not even a side project. It had become the central organizing fact of his life. This ongoing, largely thankless effort to stand between a digital kill list and the real human beings on it. In 2018, CBS News' flagship news magazine program 48 Hours became interested in the story. Reporter Peter Van Sant began investigating, eventually traveling to London to meet Montero in person. Montero agreed to speak on camera but refused to reveal the location of his apartment, a reasonable precaution given that he was dealing with people who had sent him burning car videos and filed false police reports in his name. The 48 Hours investigation ultimately led to the disruption of 4 separate potential murder plots that were active at the time of filming. Real people, who had been named on the kill list and were in genuine danger, were warned because of the work that the broadcast and Montero's ongoing monitoring made possible. Yura, meanwhile, was doing something that few criminal operators in history have had the audacity to attempt. He was talking to the media, not giving up his identity, that never happened, but communicating. He sent video statements to 48 Hours. In those videos, his face was digitally obscured and his voice was modulated, but his words were clear. "We will be waiting for you to come place your orders," one statement said, "and get rid of your problems." He talked about his operation the way a small business owner might talk about customer service. He described the Hitman marketplace as being like any other auction site that brings customers and vendors together. He seemed entirely comfortable with the idea that people were watching, that journalists were investigating, that a cybercrime researcher in London was documenting his every message. He behaved as though all of it was simply publicity. He was not entirely wrong. Every news segment that aired, every article that was published, brought new curious visitors to the dark websites he was running. Some of those visitors came to gawk or to understand. Some of them came with photographs and Bitcoin addresses already in hand. The dark web hitman economy, it turned out, did not suffer from exposure the way a normal criminal operation might. The clients were not deterred by news coverage. If anything, some of them seemed emboldened by it. The coverage confirmed that the sites existed, that the services were theoretically available, that there was a process one could follow. Yura also, at various points, attempted to construct a philosophical justification for his operation. He claimed, with apparent sincerity, or at least with the performance of sincerity, that he was performing a moral service. His argument went something like this: people who wanted to hire a hitman were going to find a way to pursue that desire regardless of whether a real hitman was available. By operating a scam site that took their money and strung them along indefinitely, he was effectively neutralizing them. He was buying time. He was keeping would-be killers occupied with a fictional process, feeding them false updates about non-existent hitmen, taking their money in exchange for nothing, and in doing so, preventing them from pursuing more direct methods of harm. In one message, Yura wrote what he apparently believed to be a sincere ethical position. It is a moral right to scam criminals and would be murderers if this helps saving victims. It is a fascinating argument. It is also, almost immediately upon examination, a self-serving one. Yura was not operating a murder deterrence charity. He was operating a scam that generated, by some estimates, the equivalent of at least 500,000 euros in revenue, and that was based on the Bitcoin value at the time. Given how dramatically Bitcoin's value has increased since 2016, the actual worth of the cryptocurrency he collected could be far, far higher. He was not taking money from would-be killers out of a burning desire to save innocent victims. He was taking money from would-be killers because that money was easy to take and nearly impossible to trace. And yet, the argument is not entirely without merit. The Allwine case suggests the counterargument that when a fake hitman operation fails to deliver, some clients will simply take matters into their own hands. But there were also clients who, according to Montero's documentation, sent money, received excuses, sent more money, received more excuses, and eventually gave up entirely. The friction introduced by the scam, the weeks of waiting, the escalating costs, the constant delays, may have been enough, in some cases, to allow murderous intent to cool. The question of how many lives might have been inadvertently saved by the Besa Mafia operation's failure to deliver is not one that anyone can answer with certainty. It is the kind of question that lives in the moral gray zone that this story keeps returning to. What is certain is that Amy Allwine is dead, and that in Brian and George's case, someone had paid for his death and he ended up dead within the specified window, in the specific location that had been submitted to a hitman website, and the case was closed as a suicide, and the questions that his father kept raising were never fully answered, and the fatal bullet was never found. Those are the certain things, and they are enough to keep Chris Montero at his monitors, building his alerts, documenting his lists, even after everything that has been done to him. The website was fake, but it kept finding real things anyway. There is something about the inside of a kill list that is genuinely difficult to communicate to someone who has never seen one. Not because the language is especially sophisticated, it is not. Ura's sites were not visited by eloquent people. The messages, by and large, were written in plain, functional prose by people who had decided to commit a serious crime and simply wanted to get on with it. What makes the list genuinely disturbing is not any individual message. It is the cumulative weight of so many ordinary grievances turned lethal. Reading through Montero's documentation of the database is like watching the worst impulses of ordinary human relationships displayed without any of the social friction that normally contains them. Here, with the anonymity of Bitcoin and the perceived safety of the dark web, people simply said what they actually wanted. And what they wanted was startling in its mundaneness. Husbands wanted wives dead. Wives wanted husbands dead, though less frequently. The gender distribution on the kill list skewed heavily male. Business partners wanted colleagues gone. An employee wanted a manager who had humiliated them in a meeting to cease to exist. Someone wanted a neighbor dead because of a long-running parking dispute. The specificity of the grievances was almost more disturbing than the violence they generated. That a parking dispute, a dispute over something so ordinary that most adults navigate it weekly, could metastasize in a particular mind into a transaction on a murder website. That a perceived slight at a workplace could calcify into a Bitcoin transfer and a photograph and an address. Montero read all of it. He kept going back to it. He found, embedded in the depravity, a strange compulsion to understand, not to excuse. There was nothing in these messages that invited excuse, but to understand the mechanism by which ordinary people arrived at the decision to visit a dark web murder site. Because the clients on the Besa Mafia kill list were not, for the most part, career criminals. They were not professional hitmen or mobsters or people with extensive records. They were, in many cases, people who had jobs and families and church memberships and parking disputes and grudges and a certain quantity of desperation that had found, in the apparent anonymity of the dark web, a container for its worst possible expression. What had the dark web offered these people? Anonymity, obviously, or the illusion of it. Bitcoin, which many of them believed was truly untraceable. Distance, a physical and psychological remove from the act itself that made it feel less real, less violent, more like a transaction. The same psychological mechanism that allows people to make morally questionable financial decisions from behind a computer screen was operating here, amplified to its most extreme possible conclusion. People who would never in their lives walk up to a stranger and say, "I want to pay you to kill my wife," were apparently comfortable typing exactly that into a message box on a.onion website. The screen created a distance. The distance made it feel safer. The Bitcoin made it feel invisible. And the apparent professionalism of the site, the menus, the messaging system, the reassuring customer service tone of Ura's responses, made it feel legitimate. Montero began referring to this phenomenon in his conversations with journalists and researchers. He had a particular way of describing the moment of commitment, the moment when someone had sent the first payment. He said, "If you've passed the barrier of having paid money to get someone killed, you are mentally committed to doing that." The payment was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of a different kind of person. Once you had sent Bitcoin to a hitman site, you had confirmed to yourself that you were someone who would do that. The act of payment was a transformation. It was crossing a line that, once crossed, changed what you were capable of believing about yourself. And what you became capable of believing was that the obstacle in your life, the wife, the colleague, the neighbor, the customer service representative, could and should be removed by any available means. This was why the Besa Mafia story was not, ultimately, a story about whether the hitman website was real. It never mattered whether the website was real. What mattered was the population of clients it attracted and what those clients were willing to do once the website failed to deliver. Some of them gave up. Some of them, like Stephen Allwine, simply stopped waiting for the professional and did the job themselves. The range of characters Montero encountered in the database was enormous. There were clients who had clearly spent significant time and thought crafting their orders, detailed dossiers on their targets, surveillance-style notes about routines and daily schedules, specific instructions about how they wanted the death to appear and what kind of aftermath they were prepared to deal with. There were clients who were manifestly confused about how the service worked, sending follow-up messages every few days asking for status updates in the same tone they might use to track a package from an online retailer. Is there any news about my order? How is the hitman progressing? I paid a deposit 3 weeks ago, and I haven't heard anything. Euro would respond to all of them in the same measured, customer service tone, regretful updates about complications, requests for additional funds to assign a higher quality operative, reassurances that the matter was being handled. There were clients who had second thoughts. Messages that began with a confident order and ended, days or weeks later, with a request to cancel. Euro would process these cancellations with apparent good grace, while quietly noting in other messages that refunds were not actually going to be issued. There were clients who threatened Euro, an almost surreal inversion of the dynamic, in which someone who had paid a murder site to kill someone was now threatening the murder site's administrator with violence if they did not deliver. I want a refund, or I'll report you to the police. Nobody ever stopped to notice the problem with that particular threat. And then there were the cases that Montero flagged as highest priority, the ones where the client seemed most committed, most financially invested, most operationally specific. The cases where every detail suggested that if the website failed to deliver, the client was going to find another way. He passed those cases to law enforcement whenever he could find a channel willing to receive them. Sometimes law enforcement acted. More often, the jurisdictional complexity, the fact that the client might be in one country, the target in another, the server in a third, and Montero himself in a fourth, ground the process to a halt before anyone could be warned. It was in this context that the Alexis Stern case emerged. Stern was a teenager living in the United States who had appeared on the kill list. Her name, her photograph, her home address submitted by an anonymous client who had paid to have her killed. The reason for the order was unclear. The messages did not illuminate the client's motivation in any specific way. Montero's systems had flagged her case. Through a circuitous chain of communication, Montero to journalist, journalist to local authorities to the FBI. A warning eventually reached Stern and her family. She was told that someone had placed a hit on her life through a dark web website. She was told that the website was a scam and no real hitman had been hired. She was also told that the person who had paid for her death was, as yet, unidentified. Imagine being a teenager and receiving that information. The website is fake, the FBI tells you. The hitman is not real. But somewhere in the world, someone who knows where you live has handed over money for the specific purpose of having you murdered. And we cannot tell you who that person is. And we are not sure what, if anything, will be done about it. Stern was angry. She was frightened. She was also, she said later, simply exhausted by the waiting, by the uncertainty, by the check-ins from federal agents that became less frequent over time as her case presumably competed with hundreds of others for attention. She wanted resolution. She wanted to know who had done this to her. She wanted the person who had paid for her death to face some kind of consequence. For a long time, none of that came. This was the experience of many of the people on the kill list who survived, who were warned, who were alive, who were safe in the narrow sense of not yet being harmed. They were left with a particular kind of wound, the knowledge that someone in their lives, someone close enough to know their address and their daily schedule, and to upload a photograph, had decided that they should not exist. That is not a wound that heals cleanly. It does not resolve with the closure of a case. It lives in the background of every interaction, in every relationship, because you do not know who it was. You do not know which person in your life is carrying that intent. You look at the people around you differently. You feel it. It follows you home. By 2018, the story of Besa Mafia and its successors had become something more than a cybercrime curiosity. It had become a case study. Journalists had written about it. Podcasters had covered it. The 48 Hours documentary had aired to significant viewership. Academic researchers were using it as a data set for studying the psychology of dark web criminal behavior. Prosecutors were referencing it in court cases. And still Euro was operating. Still the sites kept appearing. Still new clients kept arriving with their photographs and their Bitcoin and their grievances and their intent. Something had gone wrong with the assumption that exposure would end the operation. The logic of conventional law enforcement thinking, that if you expose a criminal enterprise, clients will flee and the enterprise will collapse, did not apply here. The clients were not a corporate entity that could be embarrassed into reform. They were individuals, mostly acting in isolation from each other, who had arrived at the same dark corner of the internet independently and for their own reasons. Exposing the fact that Besa Mafia was a scam did reduce traffic somewhat. After each news cycle, the volume of new orders would dip, but it never stopped entirely, and the rebranded successors quickly rebuilt the client base. The name would change, the story would reset, and someone who had read about Besa Mafia being a scam would find the new site under a different name and decide that surely this one was different. Montero, watching all of this, began to develop a specific and troubling theory. He believed, and the data supported this belief, that there were people on the kill list who represented imminent dangers. People who had paid large sums, who had been strung along for months, who had grown increasingly frustrated and increasingly specific in their requests. People who, by the pattern of their communications, were moving from the hiring a hitman mental framework toward the doing it myself mental framework. He could not always predict exactly when that transition would happen, or who would make it, but he could see it happening in the shape of the messages, the escalation of urgency, the shift in tone from transactional to desperate. He kept flagging these cases. He kept sending them to whoever would listen. And he kept setting up alerts for every name on the list, so that if something happened, he would know. In the spring of 2016, before Amy Allwine died, before Brian Njorge died, before the 48 Hours documentary, before the Romanian arrests, something happened that illustrates the daily reality of Montero's work with particular clarity. He received a message from a user that he later tracked and documented as one of the more alarming cases in the database. The user, using the alias Blackjack85, had placed a hit order and was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. The messages had escalated over weeks. Blackjack85 was writing longer and longer communications, more emotional, more urgent. In one message, he described in explicit detail how he wanted the target to suffer before dying. Yura had responded in his usual measured tone. Regrettable delays, complications with the assigned operative, an offer of an upgraded service for additional payment. Blackjack85 had paid more money. Nothing had happened. He had paid again. Still nothing. There is something genuinely strange about reading those messages. Strange because the target of Blackjack85's order was a real person, somewhere, whose name appeared in the database alongside a photograph and an address. That person was living their life without any awareness that someone they knew had paid, repeatedly, for their death. And strange because Blackjack85 himself was clearly in some kind of psychological crisis. Not a person who had coldly and rationally decided to hire an assassin and was patiently waiting for the service to be delivered, but a person who was increasingly unraveling under the weight of whatever grievance had driven them to the site in the first place. Montero flagged the case. He sent it through whatever channels were available to him. What happened to Blackjack85? Whether they were ever identified, whether the target was ever warned, whether the frustration eventually tipped into direct action, is not publicly known. That ambiguity is itself part of the texture of this story. There were hundreds of cases in the database, and the resolution of most of them is opaque. Some resulted in arrests. Some resulted in warnings that may or may not have been enough. Most disappeared into the filing systems of law enforcement agencies in multiple countries, sorted by jurisdiction and priority, and the availability of agents with the time and expertise to work them. In 2019, a researcher named Carl Miller began working with the data that Montero had compiled. Miller, who was affiliated with a think tank focused on technology and society, was preparing to present findings about the kill list at DEF CON, one of the world's largest and most prominent hacker conventions. His talk was titled, simply, The Kill List. He planned to reveal, for the first time in a public forum, the full scope of what the Besa Mafia operation had generated. He planned to disclose that beyond the 175 paid kill orders that had previously been the focus of most reporting, there were at least 2,000 other kinds of orders, inquiries, communications, requests for violence of various kinds that had not been categorized as formal hits, but that represented a staggering volume of human intent toward harm. 2,000 additional orders. From real people, with real names on the receiving end. The DEF CON presentation was watched closely by law enforcement agencies that had previously been slow to engage with the material. Partly this was the nature of the venue. Presenting findings at a major security conference gave the data a kind of institutional legitimacy that a British IT researcher's blog posts had not quite achieved. Partly it was the accumulated weight of the Amy Allwine case, and the Brian and George questions, and the arrests that had been made in various jurisdictions based on tips from Montero's database. The machinery was warming up. Slowly, with the grinding reluctance of bureaucratic systems forced to deal with something they were not designed to handle, law enforcement was beginning to take the kill list seriously. In the United States, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI had been investigating individual cases tied to the Besa Mafia operation for years. In Romania, where the IP trails had consistently pointed, where Montero had traced the edit to his Rational Wiki article back to in 2016, the country's Directorate for the Investigation of Organized Crime and Terrorism, known by the acronym DICOT, had been building a case. The coordination between American and Romanian authorities was slow and complex, complicated by the transnational nature of the crimes and the technical challenges of prosecuting a dark web operation in which most of the evidence existed in encrypted form on servers that had been specifically designed to resist investigation. But the pressure kept building. The cases kept accumulating. The kill list kept growing. And Yura kept talking. In emails to 48 Hours journalists, in video statements posted online, in messages to Montero himself, Yura maintained a strange cheerfulness about the whole enterprise. At one point, he sent a message that read, in his characteristically fractured English, "Unfortunately, after your show the business has decreased tremendously. People concluded that the site is a scam." He said this as though it were a business problem he was working to solve, rather than a criminal consequence of media scrutiny. He then claimed to have opened a restaurant and to be living well. His correspondent doubted this. Most people who tracked the case doubted this. The sites kept running. At another point, Yura said something that stayed with the people who were covering this story. He said, paraphrased and condensed, "Law enforcement cannot easily close the site because the IP is hidden and the posting is hidden." He was not wrong. The technical architecture of the Tor network made traditional law enforcement approaches genuinely difficult. You could not simply send a takedown notice to the hosting provider, because the hosting provider was an anonymized node on a distributed network. You could not subpoena records from the payment processor, because the payment processor was Bitcoin and Bitcoin was, at the transactional level, pseudonymous. You could not track the IP addresses of clients and administrators in any conventional way, because Tor was specifically designed to prevent that tracking. This was the fundamental problem. The technology was ahead of the law. The dark web had created a space in which the normal mechanisms by which society contained its most dangerous impulses, the fear of getting caught, the paper trail, the witness who saw something, were simply absent. And in that absence, people had been very willing to try things they would never have tried in a world where consequences were visible. Montero understood this better than almost anyone. He had spent years inside that space, watching people behave in ways they would not have believed themselves capable of. And he had come to a conclusion that was, in its own way, as troubling as anything in the kill list. The dark web had not created these people. The desire to harm was already there, in some of these cases, long before the website existed. What the website had done was provide a container for that desire, a shape, a process, a step-by-step mechanism that made the unthinkable feel actionable. It had, in a very precise sense, made murder feel like a service you could shop for. And once you thought of it that way, once you had uploaded the photograph and sent the Bitcoin and were waiting for a confirmation email, something had already changed inside you. Something that was very difficult to undo. The arrests, when they finally came, were dramatic. In July of 2022, Romania's DICOT announced that it had carried out raids at the request of the United States authorities. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI had been building toward this moment for years, working with Romanian investigators to trace the operators of the Basem Mafia network and its successors. The raid swept up 5 individuals and 4 witnesses. DICOT stated that American authorities had determined the group consisted of 5 or more people in Romania who had acted in a coordinated manner to administer the sites and to launder the money received through what the agency described, in careful legal language, as incitement to murder. DICOT released video footage of the raids, doors being opened, officers moving through apartments, computers and drives being seized. The imagery was, in some ways, anticlimactic. These were young men in ordinary Romanian apartments, not criminal masterminds in fortified compounds. They were technicians and marketers and money launderers, people who had sat at their own computers and managed the infrastructure of a murder-for-hire scam with the same bureaucratic diligence that someone else might bring to running an e-commerce platform. That normalcy was, in its own way, disturbing. This was not what a murder empire looked like from the inside. It looked like an office job. The damages from the operation were estimated at around 500,000 euros. But that figure was based on the cryptocurrency values at the time of the original transactions, which had taken place largely in 2015 and 2016. Bitcoin's price in 2015 and 2016 was a fraction of what it became in subsequent years. If the operators had held onto any portion of the Bitcoin they collected, a reasonable assumption, given that cryptocurrency is inherently a store of value, the actual worth of the proceeds could be dramatically higher. Montero's reaction to the news of the arrests was, by his own account, ambivalent. He was glad. After 6 years of work, after the burning car videos and the false blogs and the arrest and the jurisdictional runarounds and the Google alerts and the late nights in front of 6 monitors, there was some satisfaction in knowing that the people who had run this operation were in custody. But the satisfaction was tempered by something heavier. He wrote, in a message to a journalist, "It's great an international law enforcement operation took down these criminals, but when will they ever proactively investigate the thousands of names on the kill list?" Because that was still the open wound. The site operators were arrested. The machinery of the scam was disrupted. But the kill list remained. Thousands of names. Thousands of people who had been identified as targets by clients who, in most cases, had never been investigated, never been warned, never been arrested. The clients, the real danger, in Montero's view, were still out there. Some of them were still operating under the assumption that their orders had been lost in the chaos of the site's exposure. Some of them had moved on to other methods. Some of them, perhaps, had changed their minds. But many of them had not been identified, and the names of their intended targets were sitting in a database that Montero had been maintaining for 6 years, and the question of what was going to happen to those names remained largely unanswered. By 2022, Montero estimated that approximately 25 arrests had been made of individuals who had paid to have people killed through the various Basem Mafia successor sites. 25 out of thousands of clients. The gap between those numbers is where most of the kill list lives, in the space between documented danger and official action. The story of Yura himself, his actual identity, his precise location, the details of his personal history, remained murky even after the Romanian arrests. The individuals arrested in Romania were described as operators and money launderers connected to the network, but whether any of them was the specific person who called himself Yura, who had sent burning car videos and written customer service emails and given interviews to 48 hours via scrambled video, was never definitively confirmed in public reporting. Yura, as a persona, had always been a construction, a voice, a tone, a set of communication patterns. Whether that persona belonged to a single individual or was shared across multiple members of the network was unclear. What was clear was that the model Yura had pioneered, the dark web murder-for-hire scam, had spawned imitators that continued to operate. After the Romanian arrests, a Vice journalist easily found a similar site on the dark web aimed at Russian-speaking audiences. The journalist was directed from the site to a Telegram channel, where they asked how one might find a killer in Los Angeles. A response arrived within minutes. It was possible, arrangements could be made quickly, the cost would be $15,000. The dark web hitman economy, it appeared, was not an industry that depended on any single operator. It was a model, and the model, once established, was available to anyone with the technical skills to run a .onion website and the complete ethical absence required to invite clients to submit photographs of people they wanted dead. The arrests in Romania did not close anything. They punctuated it. The story had not ended. It had simply moved to the next chapter. And still, in the background of all of this, the questions around Brian and George had not been answered. His father, Samuel, had continued to pursue the inconsistencies he saw in the official account of his son's death. The missing devices, the unretrieved bullet, the changed life insurance beneficiary, the specific, location and date-specific knowledge that someone on the kill list had submitted about Brian's visit to Indiana. Clarksville police had told the Wired journalist who investigated the case that they were aware of the assassination order on the dark website, and that they stood by their conclusion that Brian's death was a suicide. The coroner's finding was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. No evidence of foul play had been presented that was sufficient to reopen the case. A forensic pathologist consulted for the same investigation noted that it was not unusual for bullets to go unretrieved in suicide cases. The physics of the situation do not always result in an easily recoverable projectile. The explanation for the missing devices was not given by any official source. The life insurance beneficiary change, made just 1 month before Brian's death, remained unexplained in any formal record. These were gaps. They were not proof of anything. Gaps in evidence can point toward a covered-up murder. They can also simply be the natural ambiguity of a tragedy that happened quickly and was investigated in a small jurisdiction without the resources or the mandate to dig deeper. Samuel and George wanted the case reopened. He wanted someone to look again, with all the information that was now available, including the Basim Mafia kill order, including the knowledge that someone had specifically known Brian's Airbnb address and travel dates, including the questions about his devices and his life insurance, and asked the question that he, as a father, had been asking for years. What if it was not a suicide? Nobody official has reopened the case. The question stands. Brian and George was 21 years old. He had been in the United States Army. He had been building a presence on Instagram and YouTube. He had a father who missed him and a family that grieved him, and a kill order on a dark web murder site that was filed and documented and had a Bitcoin payment attached to it. And the coroner said suicide. And the police said they were confident in that verdict. And the databases that Montero had been maintaining since 2016 had his name in them, under a kill order placed by a user called Toombib, with an Indiana Airbnb address and a 10-day window. These are the facts. They sit beside each other and refuse to form a single coherent picture. They refuse to resolve. And that refusal, the persistence of the question, the unanswered quality of it, is itself a kind of answer to the larger story this case tells. The dark web hitman economy was a scam. Nobody was ever going to be killed by a Basim Mafia operative. But the economy created by the scam, the Bitcoin trails, the compromised clients, the people who graduated from paying a fake hitman to acting directly, was real. And the bodies in that economy's wake were real. Amy Allwine's body was real. Brian and George's body was real. And the bodies of people on the kill list who have not yet appeared in news reports, because they have not yet been warned, or because something has happened to them that has not yet been connected to the database, or because they are simply alive and frightened and living with the knowledge that someone in their life paid for their death. Those are real too. What does it feel like to be on a list like this? To be told, by a federal agent or a detective or a journalist, that someone has uploaded your photograph to a dark web murder site and sent Bitcoin to have you killed? The survivors, the ones who were warned, who were protected, who are still alive, have tried to describe it in various ways, and the descriptions all converge on a particular kind of destabilization. Not the dramatic, cinematic terror of knowing someone is actively pursuing you with a weapon. Something stranger and more enduring. A reframing of reality. Because the warning does not tell you who. That is the thing that persists. The FBI shows up and says someone is paid to have you murdered on a dark website, and we are warning you for your safety, and we believe the site is a scam and no real hitman exists, and you should update your home security. And then they leave. And you are standing in your kitchen, or your living room, or wherever you happen to be when your world reshapes itself, and you know something new that you cannot unknow. Someone in your life wants you dead. Someone who knows your address, who knows enough about your daily routine to be able to answer the website's questions about your schedule, who has looked at you, perhaps recently, perhaps at dinner, perhaps at a meeting, perhaps in the school pickup line, and made the decision to transfer money for the purpose of your death. And you do not know who that person is. You look at your husband differently. You look at your business partner differently. You look at the friend you had a falling out with 6 months ago. You look at the family member who has always seemed to carry something unspoken behind their eyes. You look at everyone you know and you run the list in your head, and you try to identify the one who hates you enough to have done this. Sometimes you arrive at a strong suspicion. Sometimes the suspicion is wrong. Sometimes you never find out. The psychological literature on this kind of experience is sparse, because it is a relatively new phenomenon. The dark web murder-for-hire scam, as a specific category of threat, is only about a decade old. But what research exists, and what the survivors themselves describe, points toward a cluster of effects that sit at the intersection of trauma and uncertainty. Hypervigilance. Difficulty trusting. A persistent low-grade sense of threat that does not resolve even when the immediate danger is addressed. Sleep disturbance. The intrusive thought that someone close to you has evaluated your life and decided it should end. Some survivors found that the uncertainty was more corrosive than the threat itself would have been. If someone had walked up to them with a weapon, they would have known who and why. There would have been a moment of confrontation, however terrible, that contained its own completeness. But this, the anonymous order, the faceless client, the void where a perpetrator should be, offered no such completeness. It stayed open. It stayed uncertain. It asked questions that might never be answered. This is a dimension of the Besa Mafia story that tends to get underrepresented in the coverage, because coverage naturally gravitates toward the cases that resolve, the all-wine conviction, the Romanian arrests, the instances where an identified client was arrested and charged. The cases that resolved are narratively satisfying. They have endings. The cases that did not resolve, and there are many of them, far more than the public record reflects, are not satisfying. They are people living their lives with open wounds. There is also the question of what it is like to be the family member of someone who died in this context. Samuel and George's experience is one version of it. He is a father who believes, who cannot not believe, given what he knows, that the official account of his son's death does not contain the whole truth. He is a father sitting with inconsistencies that were never resolved, with questions that were never formally answered, with a kill order that was documented and submitted and connected in its operational details to the death that occurred within its specified window. And the case is closed. And no institution with the authority to reopen it has done so. And Samuel and George wakes up every morning in a world where his son is dead, and the circumstances of that death are officially characterized in a way that he cannot accept. That is a specific kind of grief. It carries a weight beyond loss. It carries the weight of injustice, real or perceived, and in cases as ambiguous as this one, the distinction matters less than the experience of it. Chris Montero was aware of all of this. He thought about the people on the list regularly, not just as data points, not just as names in a database, but as people. A 21-year-old Army soldier from Texas who made YouTube videos and was inseparable from his devices. A woman in Minnesota who loved her church and her community and her son. A teenager who was told that someone wanted her dead and still does not know who. These were real people who had intersected with a digital system that should have been merely fraudulent, a scam, a con, nothing more threatening than a sophisticated pickpocketing scheme, and had instead become entangled in something that reshaped or ended their lives. He also thought, sometimes, about Yura. He had communicated with Yura more than almost anyone outside the site's immediate network. He had been threatened by Yura, framed by Yura, investigated because of Yura. He had spent more hours thinking about Yura than about many people he had met in person. And somewhere beneath the frustration and the professional anger, there was a question that he occasionally turned over. Who was this person? Not in the legal sense. That was a question for prosecutors and detectives. But in the human sense. What was the interior landscape of a person who built a murder website and ran it for years, who sent burning car videos and false police reports, who wrote customer service emails to people who had paid to have their wives and colleagues killed, who gave video interviews to CBS News with a digitally scrambled face and seemed almost to enjoy the notoriety? Yura had, at various points, claimed a kind of moral coherence for his operation. He argued that he was a scammer, yes, but that he was scamming criminals, people who had already demonstrated their willingness to pay for murder and who deserved to be defrauded of their money. He had a point, in the narrowest possible sense. The clients were, by the act of submitting an order, would-be murderers. They were not sympathetic figures. Defrauding them was not, ethically, equivalent to defrauding an innocent person. Yura seemed to find comfort in this framing. But the framing collapsed under examination. Because Yura was not running a vigilante operation against would-be killers. He was not identifying clients, taking their money, and reporting them to the police. He was taking their money and stringing them along. In some cases, his ability to string them along indefinitely may have prevented killings, the friction of the process buying enough time for the intent to cool. In other cases, the stringing along simply delayed the killing, as with Stephen Allwine, who shifted from waiting for Yura's non-existent hitman to acquiring his own drugs and his own gun. And Yura had operated the site for years. He had collected hundreds of thousands of euros. He had lived on the proceeds of a murder-for-hire scam while thousands of people submitted orders for each other's deaths, some of which were fulfilled not by his non-existent hitmen, but by the clients themselves. He had sent threats to a researcher who was trying to warn potential victims. He had filed false reports that resulted in an innocent man spending 2 days in jail. He had framed a person who was, genuinely, and without any financial motive, trying to protect people whose lives were in danger. Whatever the philosophical case Yura could construct for his operation, the ledger of what he had actually done with those years was not one that bore much scrutiny. And yet, the Romanian arrests were a beginning, not an end. The model persisted. Other operators picked it up. New sites appeared. The technology that Yura had used to protect himself, Tor, Bitcoin, distributed servers, burner accounts, was freely available to anyone who wanted to use it. The dark web hitman economy, as an institution, did not depend on Yura for its existence. It depended on human nature, on the persistent reality that a certain number of people, at any given time, are willing to pay money for the deaths of people in their lives. That reality was not going anywhere. And as long as that reality existed, there would be websites willing to collect the money. Montero knew this. He had always known it. The question that animated his work was never really, can we stop this? Because stopping it entirely, eliminating the impulse and the technology and the infrastructure, was not within the capacity of any single researcher or any single law enforcement agency or any international coalition of agencies. The question was narrower and more urgent. For each specific person on a specific kill list, at a specific moment, could something be done to protect them before something happened? Sometimes yes. Sometimes the warning arrived in time. Sometimes an arrest was made before the client found another method. Sometimes the data led a detective to a conviction that kept a dangerous person away from a potential victim. And sometimes no. Sometimes the timing was wrong, or the jurisdiction was intractable, or the evidence was ruled inadmissible, or the resources were not there, or the case fell through a gap between agencies. And sometimes someone ended up face down on a baseball field. And sometimes the official verdict said one thing, and a father with his son's missing phones, and his son's changed life insurance policy, and his son's Airbnb address in a kill order knew that something was not right. Those were the cases that stayed with Chris Montero. Those were the cases he carried. There is a question that this story keeps circling but never quite lands on directly, and it is time to address it plainly. It is the question of what the dark web actually represents, not technically, but philosophically. What does it mean that a space exists in which the normal social and legal constraints on human behavior are rendered largely invisible? What does that reveal about human nature itself? The answer that the Besa Mafia case offers is not a comfortable one. The dark web did not create the desire to harm. It revealed it. It provided a container in which desires that existed already, desires that had been suppressed or managed or redirected by the friction of ordinary social life. could be expressed without apparent consequence. And what people expressed, when they believed no one was watching and no consequence was possible, was, in a significant number of cases, the desire to have someone they knew killed. This is not a minority phenomenon in the statistical sense of the kill list. Hundreds of clients placed orders on Besa Mafia and its successors. Thousands more made inquiries of various kinds. The clients represented an enormous range of demographics, different ages, different countries, different income levels, different relationships with the targets of their orders. There was no single profile. There was no single type. There were only people who, when given the opportunity to act on their worst impulses without visible consequence, acted on them. What this means for how we think about social order is disturbing. Much of what prevents most people from acting on violent impulses is not a fundamental moral commitment to nonviolence. It is consequence. It is the fear of getting caught. It is the complexity and risk of execution. It is the social visibility of violence. The fact that if you harm someone, people around you will know. The dark web stripped those barriers away, or at least appeared to. And the result was a flood of orders. Chris Montero, who had been thinking about this question longer than almost anyone, put it plainly in one of his interviews. He said something to the effect that the clients who appeared on the kill list were not particularly unusual people. They were people who had found themselves in difficult relationships, difficult financial situations, difficult workplace dynamics, the ordinary catalog of human conflict, and who had taken one additional step that most people do not take. Not because most people lack the grievance, but because most people lack the apparent mechanism. Besa Mafia provided the mechanism, and for hundreds of people, having the mechanism was enough. That is not an exculpatory observation. Understanding why people did something does not mean forgiving it. The people who paid to have others killed were wrong. They were morally wrong and legally wrong, and the consequences that followed for those who were caught were appropriate. But understanding why is important for a different reason. It is important because the mechanism is not going to disappear. The dark web exists. Cryptocurrency exists. Tor exists. And as long as those technologies exist, the mechanism will exist. Understanding the psychology of the clients, why the apparent anonymity was enough, why the mechanism unlocked impulses that would otherwise have remained locked, is the most important variable in the entire system, because it is the one that policy, technology, and law enforcement cannot easily address on their own. Yura understood this, on some level. His entire business model depended on it. He was running an operation that succeeded not because it could deliver violence, but because it could receive desire. The desire was already there, preloaded, waiting for a place to go. He had simply built the place. And he had done it, apparently, from somewhere in Romania, or with Romanian connections, at least, given the IP addresses and the DICOT arrests. He had done it with enough operational security to remain unidentified by law enforcement for years, even as his operation was covered by 48 Hours and Wired and Harper's Magazine and Vice. He had done it while communicating, with apparent recklessness, with a London cybercrime researcher who was doing everything in his power to expose him. He had done it while running a freelance marketing campaign through an Indian internet marketer, while sending threatening videos to critics, while filing false reports that resulted in his critics' arrest. He had done it through multiple iterations and rebrands, and the complete collapse of each previous version of the site. For 6 years, Euro won. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the narrative of the Romanian arrests makes it easy to conclude that justice eventually prevailed, and the story, therefore, has a conventional resolution. But the resolution is not conventional. The people arrested in Romania were operators of a network, not necessarily the same person as the administrator who had been communicating directly with clients and critics for 6 years. The kill list remained. The model remained. Yura, whoever Yura actually was, had operated freely for 6 years, had made a substantial amount of money, had damaged the lives of the people on the kill list and the people who had been trying to expose him, and had then, potentially, disappeared back into whatever ordinary life preceded the operation. There is something in that outcome that resists easy resolution. It does not feel like justice. It feels like a partial accounting, an incomplete ledger, a story with pages missing. But this is often what true crime is. This is what separates it from fiction. In fiction, the resolution is constructed to satisfy. The killer is caught and sentenced, and the narrative closes cleanly. In reality, The closure is often partial, the questions often unanswered, the justice often incomplete. The bodies are real and the grief is real, and the mechanisms that produce the tragedy often persist. Through 2020 and 2021, as the Amy Allwine case receded from the news cycle and Brian and George's case remained officially closed, Montero continued his work. He gave interviews. He maintained his databases. He built new tools. He set up new alerts. He connected with journalists and researchers and law enforcement contacts in multiple countries, passing information, flagging cases, trying to move the glacier of institutional response 1 inch at a time. He also, occasionally, thought about stopping. He said so in interviews. There were moments when the cumulative weight of the material, the depravity of the messages, the personal attacks, the sense of being perpetually behind the curve of a criminal operation that kept rebuilding itself faster than it could be dismantled, became genuinely difficult to carry. He had not signed up for this. He had simply written an article on Rational Wiki debunking a dark web myth, and an anonymous Romanian operator had decided, for his own business reasons, to provoke an argument. That argument had turned into 6 years of his life. But he kept going. The list was real. The names on it were real. And until someone with more resources and more authority took over the work of watching those names and protecting those people, he was going to keep doing it. That was the simple math of it, in the end. Not heroism. He was careful to resist that framing. Just the recognition that someone had to be doing this, and he was the person who happened to have started, and stopping did not feel like a responsible option when there were still names on the list that had not been investigated. In 2022, around the time of the Romanian arrests, Montero gave an estimate. Approximately 25 arrests had been made of individuals who had paid to have people killed through Besa Mafia and its successors. Over 30 convictions across multiple countries, including the United States and Denmark. These were not trivial numbers. These were real consequences for real people who had used a fake murder service to express real murderous intent. But the denominator was thousands. The 25 arrested were a fraction of the total. The 30-plus convicted were a fraction of the total. The rest remained on the list, identified, documented, in many cases unflagged by any law enforcement agency, while the people whose names they had submitted to a murder website went about their lives. Those people were still waiting, and most of them did not know they were waiting. They did not know they were on a list. They had no idea that in a database maintained by a researcher in London, their photograph and their address were attached to a Bitcoin transaction and a message from someone who wanted them gone. That was perhaps the most disturbing truth of the whole operation. Not the site, not Eura, not even the kill list itself, but the fact that most of the people on the receiving end of those orders had no idea they were on it. They were going about their ordinary lives in complete ignorance of the fact that somewhere, in the dark infrastructure of the internet, a record existed of someone's desire for their death, a desire specific enough to attach a face and an address and a method and a Bitcoin payment. They were living in a threat they could not see. The year 2019 brought something that the story had not yet had, a mainstream audience reckoning with the full scope of what the Besa Mafia operation represented. The DEF CON presentation by Carl Miller was part of it. The Harper's Magazine piece by Brian Merchant, published in early 2020, was another significant moment. Long-form, deeply reported, the kind of piece that places a complex story in the hands of a general reader and says, "This is real, this is happening, this is what it means." Merchant had spent months working with Montero, reviewing the database, following individual cases, talking to survivors and law enforcement and legal experts. His piece described in careful detail the experience of sitting with the kill list, the numbing accumulation of requests for violence, and then the moments when something cut through the numbness. The 14-year-old in New Jersey, the woman who had received anonymous emails telling her to commit suicide while her husband sat next to her at the dinner table. The young Army soldier found face down on a baseball field. The piece also described Merchant's own encounter with one of the active cases, a young woman named Alexis Stern, whose case illustrated the failure mode of the warning system with particular clarity. Stern had been warned. The FBI had told her about the hit order. She was alive and unharmed. And yet months had passed with no arrest of the person who had submitted the order, no identification of the client, no resolution of the fundamental threat. The check-ins from federal agents had grown less frequent. The case seemed, from Stern's perspective, to be drifting. She had been warned that she was in danger, and then left to live with that knowledge indefinitely. The Harper's piece reached readers who had not been following the Besa Mafia story through the cybercrime and dark web channels that had covered it up to that point. It landed with the weight of careful journalism in a publication that commanded serious attention, and it expanded the audience for the story significantly. It also changed, in subtle ways, how the story was being told, shifting the emphasis from the mechanics of the scam itself to the human consequences of what the scam had revealed. The dark web hitman economy was not interesting because dark web technology was interesting. It was interesting, it was important, because it had exposed something about human nature that was both disturbing and profoundly recognizable. Meanwhile, in the actual geography of the story, things were continuing to move. Individual prosecutions were proceeding in various jurisdictions. In the United States, several people who had placed orders on the kill list had been charged and convicted. The legal theory being applied was relatively settled by this point. Submitting a genuine order, with a genuine target, with genuine payment attached, to a service that the client genuinely believed was capable of carrying out the murder, constituted conspiracy to commit murder or solicitation of murder regardless of whether the hitman was real. The fictitious nature of the service was not a defense. Intent was the operative element, and intent was provable through the messages, the payment records, and the operational specificity of the orders. Some defense attorneys attempted to argue the opposite, that if the service was a fraud, no real conspiracy could be said to have existed, since a conspiracy requires two parties who genuinely intend to carry out the criminal act, and Ura had never genuinely intended to carry out anything. Courts, by and large, rejected this argument. The client's intent was real. The client had done everything within their power to arrange a killing. The fact that the other party to the transaction was a scammer did not transform the client's conduct from criminal to innocent. They had attempted to commission a murder. That was what they had done. The convictions that followed were spread across the country and beyond. A man in Denmark had placed an order on the site and was convicted of attempted murder under Danish law. Cases in multiple U.S. states led to guilty pleas and sentences. A woman in one case had paid to have a neighbor killed over a dispute about property lines. A man had paid to have his former employer killed. The range of motivations was, as always, broadly representative of the full catalog of human grievance in its most extreme expression. Montero's role in these prosecutions was complicated. He had obtained the data that formed the evidentiary foundation of many of the cases through methods that were, legally speaking, a hack. He had exploited a vulnerability in a website without authorization. The data he had extracted was illegally obtained. This created evidentiary challenges in jurisdictions with strict rules about the admissibility of illegally obtained evidence. In the UK, where he was based, the NCA had been explicit about their reluctance to use his data. In the US, prosecutors had found ways to work around the problem in some cases, using Montero's data as investigative leads that pointed them toward evidence they could obtain through legal means, rather than presenting the data itself as direct evidence. The workaround was imperfect. It added time and complexity to investigations that were already slow. It meant that in some cases where Montero had provided detailed information about a specific client, the prosecution could not proceed because the chain of custody for the evidence was compromised by its origins. There were people on the kill list who had been clearly identified through Montero's data, but who could not be prosecuted because the path from the data to the arrest was too legally contaminated. This was one of the structural failures of the system's response to the Besa Mafia case, and it is worth naming it plainly. A private researcher, working without pay and without any official authorization, obtained critical evidence of hundreds of murder conspiracies through unauthorized access to a criminal website. He passed that evidence to law enforcement. Law enforcement, in many cases, was unable to use it in court because of the manner in which it had been obtained. The result was that the evidence existed, the cases were knowable, the clients were identifiable, but the legal machinery for prosecuting them was compromised by the very mechanism through which the evidence had been found. This is not a simple problem. The rules that govern evidence admissibility exist for important reasons. They protect against abuses of power, against evidence fabrication, against the kind of state overreach that can destroy the rights of innocent people. Those rules matter, but they create, In situations like this one, a specific and terrible inefficiency. The innocent people whose names were on the kill list were being protected from potential prosecutorial harm to their perpetrators by rules designed to protect the innocent. The symmetry was exact and maddening. Montero was aware of this irony. He discussed it in interviews with characteristic directness. He was not arguing that the rules should be discarded. He was arguing that the rules, as they existed, were failing to adapt quickly enough to the reality of dark web criminal investigations, where much of the most important evidence would necessarily come from sources and methods that did not fit neatly into existing frameworks. He was arguing for a conversation, a serious, institutional, policy-level conversation, about how law enforcement agencies could work more effectively with researchers like him without compromising the legal foundations of the prosecutions that followed. That conversation was happening, very slowly, in the background of the cases. It was happening in academic papers, and in conference presentations, and in the kind of closed-door meetings between prosecutors and cybersecurity professionals that do not generate press releases. Whether it would result in meaningful policy change, whether the legal frameworks around dark web investigations would evolve in a way that made the Besa Mafia situation easier to handle in the future, was not clear. Systems evolve slowly. Technology evolves quickly. The gap between them is where most of the damage in this story occurred. In the middle of all this, the question that Yura had raised, the strange moral argument about scamming would-be murderers, kept surfacing in commentary and analysis. It was an uncomfortable question because it admitted of no clean answer. The Allwine case suggested that scamming murderers was dangerous because it could provoke them to act directly. Other cases suggested the opposite, that the prolonged frustration of trying to hire a non-existent hitman had been enough to defuse the intent entirely, to exhaust the would-be killer's resolve and allow the grievance to recede to something manageable. The truth was probably both things simultaneously, depending on the specific psychology of the specific client. For some people, the scam was a circuit breaker, a sufficient mechanism for channeling the intent into a safe dead end. For others, it was kindling, building resentment and frustration and a sense of being owed something that eventually found expression in direct action. The same website, the same experience of being defrauded and delayed and extracted from, produced opposite outcomes in different people. There was no formula. There was only the individual and the specific weight of what they were carrying, and whether the friction of the scam was more than their intent could sustain. One of the things that made the Besa Mafia story so difficult for mainstream audiences to fully absorb was its refusal to organize itself around a conventional victim-perpetrator axis. In most true crime narratives, there are clear roles. There is an innocent person who did nothing to deserve what happened to them. There is a perpetrator who had agency and made choices and bears responsibility for those choices. There is, often, a detective or investigator who stands between the two and attempts to restore order. The roles are clear. The emotional architecture is familiar. The Besa Mafia case scrambled all of that. The victims, the people whose names appeared on the kill list, who were photographed and targeted and in some cases killed, were unambiguously victims. That was clear. But the apparent perpetrators, the clients who submitted the orders, were themselves often in states of genuine distress. This did not excuse their actions. It did not reduce their culpability. But it complicated the clean emotional geometry that true crime usually provides. Stephen Allwine was a murderer. He was also, by the evidence that emerged during the trial, a man in a deeply dysfunctional marriage, living a secret life that had created pressures he found impossible to manage. Amy was his victim. That truth is total. But Stephen himself was also a person, a recognizable, flawed, specific person, who had made a series of choices over time that led to the worst possible outcome. The clients on the kill list were not monsters imported from outside the normal human community. They were members of the normal human community who had crossed a line. That is harder to hold than a monster. It is harder to contain, narratively. It requires a more complicated emotional engagement from the audience. Chris Montero had developed, over years of reading these messages, a particular kind of clinical detachment, the kind that researchers and investigators develop as a psychological protection against the material they are studying. He could read a message from someone describing, in explicit detail, how they wanted a family member to die, and process it as data. Flag it. Archive it. Send it to the appropriate authority. Move to the next one. He had built the armor he needed to do the work. But the armor was not total. There were cases that got through. Cases where something specific, a name, a detail, a phrase, broke through the professional distance and became simply human. The 14-year-old in New Jersey was one of those cases. Brian and George was one of those cases. The young man's face in the yearbook photo, the one Toombib had uploaded with the location and the dates and the 10-day window, that face got through. By 2021, Montero had been doing this for 5 years. 5 years of 6 monitors, of kill lists and Bitcoin trails and jurisdictional tangles and false arrests and burning car videos and late-night message alerts and the slow, grinding work of trying to get institutions to move on cases they were not built to handle. He was, by this point, one of the world's foremost experts on dark web murder-for-hire operations. Not because he had set out to be, but because the work had accumulated and expertise had accumulated with it. He was also, by this point, a changed person. He had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate precisely. He had not become cynical, exactly. He still cared about the names on the list, still set the alerts, still followed the cases, still felt the specific weight of each unresolved situation. But something about his experience of humanity had been altered by 5 years of reading messages from people who wanted to pay for other people's deaths. He had seen too much of what people were capable of when they believed no one was watching. He could not unsee it. It was part of his knowledge of the world now, woven into the way he understood the people around him. He sometimes said, in interviews, that the thing that had surprised him most about the kill list was not the violence, but the pettiness. He had expected, going in, that the clients who used murder sites would be people with extreme, overwhelming grievances, people cornered by circumstances, facing genuine threats to their own survival or well-being. He found, instead, that a significant portion of the orders were rooted in things that were trivial by any reasonable standard. A parking dispute, a restaurant charge disputed incorrectly, a promotion that went to the wrong person, a social media disagreement. The smallness of some of the motivations, the yawning gap between the grievance and the response, was what stayed with him most, because it meant that the threshold between ordinary human frustration and the willingness to pay for someone's death was not, for some people, particularly high. Given the right conditions, the perceived anonymity, the accessible mechanism, the Bitcoin that felt invisible, the threshold was surprisingly, troublingly low. And that was a fact about human nature that could not be limited to dark web users. The dark web users were a self-selected group. Yes, people who knew enough about Tor and cryptocurrency to access and use the sites. But the underlying psychology they represented was not unique to them. The grievances they felt were ordinary. The impulse that drove them to the sites, the impulse to wish harm on someone who had wronged them, was universal. Most people managed that impulse through ordinary social friction. Remove the friction, and the management sometimes failed. This was the message that Montero had been trying to communicate, in various ways, for years. Not that everyone was a potential killer, that was not what the data showed, but that the conditions under which ordinary people became capable of extraordinary harm were less extraordinary than most people liked to believe. The dark web had created, inadvertently, a controlled experiment in human nature under conditions of perceived anonymity and consequence-free action. And the results of that experiment were uncomfortable. The Amy Allwine case had shown what happened when a client moved from the perceived anonymity of the dark web to direct action. The Brian and George case showed, or raised the question of, what might happen when a kill order and a death coincided within a specified window, and the official verdict did not account for the kill order. Individually, each of these cases was a tragedy. Together, they were a data set. And what the data set showed was that the line between a Bitcoin transaction on a dark web scam site and real-world violence was thinner than the fictional framing of the website made it appear. The hitman was fake. The line was real. That was the lesson. That was what 5 years of work in the background of this story, in the unlit space between law enforcement and journalism and cybercrime research, had established. And it was a lesson that, as of the Romanian arrests and beyond, was still in the process of being absorbed by the institutions that had the power and the responsibility to act on it. In the United States, prosecutors in multiple states had used the Basim Mafia precedent to develop charging strategies for dark web murder-for-hire cases. The legal framework was increasingly settled. The challenge was investigative capacity, the ability to identify and build cases against the thousands of clients whose information existed in Montero's database, but whose prosecutions required the kind of time and resources that most law enforcement agencies did not have in abundance. In the United Kingdom, the NCA remained cautious about working with illegally obtained data, even data that pointed to ongoing threats against named individuals. The jurisdictional challenges of a British researcher with information about crimes being planned in the United States by clients whose identities were unknown but whose payment records were documented were formidable. The systems were not built for this. They needed to be rebuilt. Whether they would be rebuilt in time to protect the people still on the list was not a question anyone could answer with confidence. And across the world, the successor sites to Besa Mafia continued to operate. New sites appeared regularly, some on the dark web, some on Telegram, some on other encrypted platforms that had become the new frontier of criminal communication. The model was free. The technology was available. The demand was not going anywhere. The war was not over. It had simply changed terrain. Let us go back to Brian and George one more time. Let us sit with his story a little longer, because it deserves that time. Because a 21-year-old man is dead, and the circumstances of his death have never been fully accounted for. And the fact that there was a kill order on a dark web website attached to his name and his address and a 10-day window that exactly encompassed the days of his death has not been incorporated into the official record of what happened to him. Brian was from Texas. He had enlisted in the Army and was stationed at Fort Knox in Kentucky. In June of 2018, he took leave and traveled to Indiana, specifically to Clarksville, Indiana, where he had booked an Airbnb. The person who called themselves Toon Bib had submitted that Airbnb address to a Besa Mafia successor site. They had noted, precisely, that Brian would only be at that location between June 1st and June 11th. They had uploaded a photograph, his school yearbook photo, the kind of formal portrait that schools take every year and that ends up in parents' albums and on mantelpieces. They had sent approximately $5,500 in Bitcoin. On June 8th, Brian and George entered a shooting range called American Shooters in Clarksville's northwest and stole a gun. That action alone is strange and has never been fully explained. Brian was a soldier. He had access to firearms through military channels. Why would he steal a gun from a civilian range? That question sits in the record without an answer. In the early hours of June 9th, Brian and George was found dead on a baseball field in Clarksville. He was face down under the stairs of an announcer's box. The wound was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot. The case was closed quickly. Suicide. His father, Samuel and George, said the police never told him about the kill order. He said that when he began to look at the details of the case, he found things that did not add up. The bullet from the fatal wound was never recovered. Unusual, though not unheard of, in suicide cases. The case report and the autopsy contained what Samuel described as inconsistencies, though he did not specify them publicly in the way that would allow independent verification. Brian's devices, his laptop, his camera, his 2 phones, were never found. A young man who documented his life constantly on Instagram and YouTube, who carried his devices everywhere, who was building an online presence and relied on his phone as a working tool of that presence, had left for Indiana with his devices and died there without them. They were simply gone. And then there was the life insurance. For $100,000. 1 month before Brian's death, he had changed the beneficiary. His parents were removed. A female friend was designated. Brian's father did not know her well. He did not know if she had been with Brian in Indiana or had known about the trip. The Clarksville Police Department, when asked by journalists about the kill order, confirmed that they were aware of it and stated that they stood by their conclusion. The case was closed. The verdict was suicide. Samuel and George is a father. He will always be a father. And fathers do not close. They do not accept a verdict that leaves questions unanswered, not when the questions are the ones that Samuel is carrying. Not when his son was 21 years old and had a future in a YouTube channel and a yearbook photo that someone had uploaded to a murder website with an address and a 10-day window. The questions he asks are not unreasonable. They are the questions a jury would ask. They are the questions a detective would ask. They are the questions that have not been answered officially in any forum with the authority to reopen the case. Who is Toon Bib? The username resolves to nothing in any public record. The Bitcoin payment was sent, and Bitcoin payments are pseudonymous, traceable, in theory, with the right tools and authority, but not easily. The Clarksville Police Department is a small jurisdiction with limited resources. Whether the forensic analysis of the Bitcoin trail was ever conducted, whether Toonbib was ever identified, even internally, even in a file that was then set aside because the verdict was already suicide, is not known publicly. Who knew that Brian would be at that specific Airbnb? The address was in the kill order. That level of specificity requires either direct knowledge of Brian's travel plans or access to his communications. Someone who knew Brian. Someone he trusted enough to discuss a trip with. Someone who knew where he was staying and on what dates and could submit that information to a murder website with enough confidence in its accuracy to attach Bitcoin to it. Who was the woman who became the beneficiary of a $400,000 life insurance policy 1 month before Brian died? That question has not been answered publicly. It may have been answered in a police file somewhere. It may not have been asked at all, if the case was processed rapidly as a suicide with no indication that further investigation was warranted. These questions do not prove murder. The absence of answers does not constitute evidence of a covered-up killing. Bullets go unretrieved in suicide cases. Devices go missing. People change life insurance beneficiaries for reasons that are not sinister. Young men on leave from military service sometimes carry burdens that are not visible to the people who love them, and sometimes make irreversible decisions in the early hours of a morning in a strange city. All of that is true. And also true, there was a kill order. There was a Bitcoin payment. There was a 10-day window that exactly corresponded to the trip Brian took to Indiana. There was someone who knew where he would be staying. There was a stolen gun from a civilian range, used by a soldier who had access to military firearms. There were missing devices. There was a changed beneficiary. And there was a father who was never told about the kill order, who believes his son's death was not what the official record says it was, and who has no institutional avenue for pursuing that belief. Chris Montero read all of this. He had been the one who received the anonymous email with the subject line suicide or murder, the question mark trembling at the end like a held breath. He had been the one who matched the kill order to the death, who saw that Brian and George had been targeted in a window that enclosed the date he died. He had been the one who filed the Google alert, who saw the Indiana News report about a body on a baseball field, who made the connection that no official investigator had made publicly. He did not know what happened to Brian and George. He had his suspicions, and his suspicions were shaped by 5 years of reading a database in which dozens of orders had been placed with the same kind of operational specificity, the kind of specificity that suggests not fantasy, not roleplay, not an anonymous grievance vented through a keyboard, but actual knowledge, actual planning, actual intent. He had his suspicions, and he carried them the way he carried all of the cases on the list, carefully, without certainty, but without setting them down either. The world moved on from Brian and George's death quickly. Small-town Indiana news has a short half-life. The suicide ruling provided a narrative closure that real-world audiences needed and accepted. The dark web kill order was not part of that closure. It was a detail that existed in a different register, in the world of cybercrime research and journalistic investigation, and the two worlds did not connect in a way that produced institutional action. Samuel and George is still waiting. For something. For someone. For the connection to be made, officially, in a forum with the authority to act on it. He may wait forever. That is the Brian and George case. That is what it is, and what it is not. And it sits in this story the way it sits in history. Unresolved, its questions still alive, the question mark in the subject line of that anonymous email still hanging in the air. The way this story ends, insofar as it ends at all, is not the way anyone would have written it. There are no heroes riding off into the sunset. There is no villain behind bars with a confirmed identity and a sentence name. There is a researcher in London who has given years of his life to a cause that no institution specifically asked him to take up, who has been threatened and arrested and framed and exhausted by the work, and who is still doing it. There are people on a kill list, some warned and some not. There are convictions in multiple countries, 25 arrested, 30 plus convicted, fractions of a much larger number. There are bodies. There are unanswered questions. There is also, in the background of all of this, something that deserves to be named. There is the question of what, if anything, has changed. Whether the Besa Mafia case, with all of its exposure, all of its journalism, all of its legal proceedings, has actually made the dark web hitman economy smaller or safer or less dangerous. The honest answer is, probably not much. The Romanian arrests disrupted one specific network. The prosecutions of individual clients created deterrence in theory, but deterrence requires publicity, and the clients who appear on kill lists are not, by definition, people who are carefully calculating the risk of getting caught. They are people who believe they are invisible. They are people who have already convinced themselves that the anonymity of Bitcoin and Tor makes consequence impossible. Telling those people that other people have been caught may shift some behaviors at the margin. It is unlikely to close the gap between the thousands of clients and the 25 arrested. The technology has continued to evolve. Telegram has become a significant new channel for these kinds of criminal communications, more accessible than the dark web, less technically demanding, still nominally anonymous, and with an encryption layer that complicates law enforcement interception. The sites that once required Tor to access now recruit clients through surface web social media platforms before directing them to more encrypted communications. The barrier to entry has, if anything, lowered. The model has become easier to replicate, not harder. And the underlying demand has not changed. Whatever combination of grievance and psychology and anonymity perception drives people to submit a name and a photograph and a Bitcoin payment to a murder website, that combination is not a product of any particular technology. It is a product of human nature under particular conditions. Those conditions are not going away. So what is the story, finally? What is the lesson? The hitman was fake. That bears repeating, because it is easy, over the course of this many hours of story, to lose track of that central fact. No professional assassin was ever deployed through Besa Mafia. No killing was ever carried out by any operative connected to Yura's network. The operation was a fraud from beginning to end, designed to extract Bitcoin from people who wanted someone dead, never intending to deliver anything in exchange. But the clients were real, and some of them killed anyway. And the database of people who wanted other people dead, documented, archived, in many cases unacted upon, is real. And the people on the receiving end of those orders are real. And the grief is real. And the unanswered questions are real. The website was a fiction. The intent was not. And intent, it turns out, is what the justice system was built to address. Not the fiction of the mechanism, but the reality of the intent. The question of whether courts and law enforcement agencies and international institutions have evolved quickly enough to address that intent, to find it and name it and hold it accountable in the new spaces where it lives, is a question that the Besa Mafia case raised and did not resolve. Chris Montero raised it louder than almost anyone. He did so at personal cost, over years, without institutional support, against an operator who was willing to use threatening videos and false arrests and SEO campaigns to silence him. He did so because he believed, and the belief was correct, however imperfectly it was validated, that the names on the list were not abstractions. They were people, and people deserved, if nothing else, to have someone watching. The Romanian arrests were announced in July of 2024. Dicot released the footage. 5 people detained, for witnesses. The damage from the operation estimated at €500,000. The network's Bitcoin proceeds, at current values, likely worth many times that. The news cycle was brief. The coverage was thorough in the corners of the internet that followed this story and absent in most other places. The kill list remained. The successor sites remained. Montero's reaction, ambivalent, quietly furious, focused on the gap between what had been done and what remained undone, was published in a message to a journalist at Vice Motherboard. "It's great," he said, "but when will they ever proactively investigate the thousands of names on the kill list?" That question is still waiting for an answer. The dark web moves faster than the law. It always has. It probably always will, by a certain number of steps, because the law is reactive by design and technology is creative by nature. The people who build things are always ahead of the people who regulate things. The people who exploit new spaces are always ahead of the people who police them. This is not a new problem. It is as old as the relationship between human innovation and human governance. But in the specific case of the dark web hitman economy, the gap between the pace of criminal innovation and the pace of institutional response has had a cost that can be measured in names on a list. embodies. In a father who will never get his questions answered. In a woman who was told her husband loved her until the forensic examiner found a Bitcoin wallet address in a deleted file. That is the cost of the gap. It is a human cost. And it is ongoing. Before we hear the final pieces of this story, if you have been watching this far, if this story has kept you up past midnight or pulled you through a lunch break or found you on the elliptical at the gym, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. Not for any algorithmic reason, though that does help, but because this kind of story deserves to be heard. Because Brian and George deserves to be known. Because Amy Allwine deserves to be more than a true crime statistic. Because Chris Montero deserves to know that the work he did in relative isolation, against long odds, for no pay, found an audience that understood what it meant. The hitman was fake. The intent was real. The story is not over. In the years after the Romanian arrests, the conversation about dark web murder-for-hire sites began to shift in ways that Montero had been anticipating for a long time. The question was no longer whether such sites were a genuine threat. The Allwine conviction, the 30-plus convictions across multiple countries, the Romanian arrests, the documented cases of real-world violence linked to kill orders had collectively settled that question. The sites were not merely a peculiarity of the criminal internet. They were a mechanism through which real murderous intent found real expression and, in some cases, real consequence. The question that was beginning to be asked, in policy circles and academic circles and law enforcement conferences, was more structural. It was the question of what a coherent, cross-jurisdictional response to this category of crime actually looked like. How do you build a system that can, in real time, take information from a researcher like Montero, match it against known individuals in multiple countries, alert potential victims, identify and investigate clients, and prosecute successfully, all in a legal framework that was designed for a world where evidence was physical and jurisdiction was geographic? It was not an easy question. The people asking it were serious people who understood both the urgency of the problem and the genuine complexity of the solution. They were not simply calling for more resources, though more resources were clearly needed. They were asking something harder, whether the institutional architecture of law enforcement, which had evolved over centuries for a particular kind of crime in a particular kind of world, could adapt quickly enough to address a kind of crime that was categorically different in almost every structural way. The dark web murder-for-hire case was not simply a crime committed in a difficult-to-access space. It was a crime that was transnational by design. The website was hosted in one country. The administrator was in another. The clients were distributed across dozens. The potential victims were distributed across dozens more. The evidence was encrypted and pseudonymous and distributed across multiple servers. The traditional model of law enforcement, jurisdictional, evidence-based, relatively slow-moving, was not built for this. It was built for a world where crime happened in a place and left physical traces. What the Besa Mafia case illustrated, more starkly than almost any other case in the history of digital crime, was the gap between that traditional model and the reality of 21st century criminal operations. The gap was not merely technical. It was institutional, legal, international, and deeply political. Because cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different countries depends on political relationships between those countries, relationships that are subject to all the normal pressures and fractures of geopolitics. The Romanian arrests happened partly because the relationship between American and Romanian law enforcement, and between American law enforcement and DICOT specifically, was strong enough to sustain the cooperation necessary for a joint operation. That cooperation was not guaranteed. It was built over years of case-by-case engagement. Other jurisdictions, other countries with citizens on the kill list, other countries where clients were based, had not necessarily built the same relationships or had the same willingness to cooperate. Montero watched all of this from London. He continued his work. He continued to maintain the databases, to run the alerts, to flag the cases that seemed most urgent, to pass information through whatever channels would receive it. He was, by this point, something of an institution himself, a one-man early warning system for a category of threat that multiple government agencies had still not fully systematized. He gave talks. He wrote. He was interviewed. He continued to be one of the most important living sources of institutional knowledge about how dark web murder operations worked, who the clients were, what the patterns of behavior looked like, and what the gap between intent and action required in order to be interrupted. The psychological cost of this work was significant, and, in interviews, he discussed it with more openness as the years went on. He talked about the cumulative weight of the material, the daily exposure to messages from people describing, in clinical or emotional detail, how they wanted others to die. He talked about the difficulty of maintaining professional distance from the individual cases, particularly when he had been the one to set the Google alert that flagged a death, when he had been the one to connect a news report to a name in the database. He talked about the specific experience of reading the message that had arrived in his inbox with the subject suicide or murder, and of then reading the Indiana news report about a body on a baseball field and understanding what he was looking at. He had not been sleeping particularly well. He had found, over the years, that the work had colonized his imagination in ways he could not always control, that the faces from the photographs in the database appeared in his thoughts unbidden, that the specific phrases from the worst messages would surface at inopportune moments. He had sought, and found, various ways of managing this. Compartmentalization, exercise, the social anchors of ordinary life, the work itself, which demanded a kind of focus that could be its own form of relief from the material it generated. He was not, by his own account, suffering in any dramatic or clinical sense. He was simply carrying a weight that had accumulated over years, and that was not getting lighter. There were also, increasingly, moments of something like gratitude. He received messages, occasionally, from people who had been on the kill list and had been warned, who knew that Montero's work had been part of the chain of events that resulted in their being warned. He did not know all of their names. Many of them were unknown to him. The warning had passed through law enforcement or through journalists, and had not come from him directly. But some of them knew. Some of them reached out. Those messages were not a comfort in the simple sense of erasing what the work cost, but they were a reminder of what it was for. It was also, increasingly, possible to point to a body of work that had genuinely changed things. Before Besa Mafia, the idea of prosecuting someone for attempted murder on the basis of an order placed on a dark web scam site was largely untested. The legal arguments had not been made in court. The precedents had not been established. After Besa Mafia, after the all-wine conviction, after the international prosecutions, after the Romanian arrests, there was case law. There were precedents. There were prosecutors who knew how to make the argument and judges who had ruled on it. The legal infrastructure for treating dark web murder orders as serious criminal acts had been built, case by case, over the years of the Besa Mafia operation and its successors. That was a real change. It was not the change that felt most urgent. The kill list still had thousands of names. The arrests were still a fraction of the clients. The threat was still largely unaddressed. But it was a change. The law had moved. Slowly, imperfectly, with the grinding reluctance of institutional systems forced to confront things they were not designed for. But it had moved. Whether it had moved far enough, fast enough, to protect the people who were still on the list, that was the question that Montero still asked. Every time he sat down in front of his monitors, every time a Google alert came in, and he held his breath for a moment before clicking. The dark web was still there. The Tor network was still there. Bitcoin was still there. The successor sites to Besa Mafia were still there, appearing, disappearing, rebranding, collecting clients. The same model, the same broken English, the same customer service tone in the responses, the same endless excuses for why no murder had yet been delivered. And the same clients arriving with their photographs and their grief and their grievances and their Bitcoin, believing, despite everything, despite the news coverage and the prosecutions and the warnings and the arrests, that they had found the mechanism they were looking for. They had not. The mechanism was never real. It was always, from the beginning, a fiction built to receive desire and extract money and do nothing else. The hitman was fake, but the intent was always, always real. And somewhere in the gap between the fake mechanism and the real intent, people had lived and died and been warned and not been warned and been convicted and not been convicted and asked questions that were never answered. That gap, between what the website claimed to be and what it actually was, between the desire it received and the consequences it produced, was where this story lived. It was a gap in the architecture of the internet, in the fabric of law enforcement, in the understanding of human nature that most of us carry through our ordinary days. A gap through which certain things fell that should not have fallen. The The story of Besa Mafia is, in the end, a story about that gap, about what lives there, about what it costs to ignore it and what it costs to spend years trying to close it, and about the fact that closing it entirely may not be possible, that some version of the gap will always exist, in some corner of human technology, waiting for the next person who believes that desire plus anonymity equals consequence-free action. The hitman was fake. The desire was not. The consequences were not. The question of what we do with that knowledge, individually, institutionally, as a society that has built technologies faster than we have built the wisdom to govern them, remains open. It will probably remain open for a long time. There is a particular kind of story that stays with you after you have heard it. Not because it resolves, not because it gives you an ending that satisfies, but because it refuses to. Because it keeps asking a question that you cannot answer cleanly, and that refusal, that open, persistent, unresolved quality, is itself the message. The message is, this is not over. The message is, these things are still happening. The message is, someone needs to be paying attention. Chris Montero has been paying attention for a long time. He will probably keep paying attention for longer still. Not because the work is rewarding in any conventional sense of that word. Not because he has been celebrated or compensated or even reliably believed. But because the list is real, and the names on it are real, and someone who knows what he knows cannot in good conscience simply stop knowing it. That is a particular kind of burden. It is the burden of the person who has seen something that most people have not seen, and who understands that what they have seen has implications, urgent, human, life or death implications, that are not being adequately addressed by the institutions that are supposed to address them. It is the burden of the witness who cannot unwitness, the researcher who cannot unknow, the person who set up a Google alert for hundreds of names and then spent years reading the results. There is something in Chris Montero's story that goes beyond the technical details of dark web hacking and Bitcoin trails and Tor networks. There is something in it that is fundamentally about what a person does when they find themselves in possession of knowledge that they did not ask for and cannot easily share. He could have walked away. He could have published his Rational Wiki article, received the burning car video, called his lawyer, and decided that one man in a London flat was not positioned to fight a transnational criminal operation with the full indifference of multiple law enforcement agencies and the structural limitations of a legal system built for a different century. He could have made that entirely rational decision. He did not. There is also something in the story of Amy Allwine that deserves a final moment of attention. Because Amy Allwine was not a character in a crime narrative. She was a woman. She went to church and she loved her community and she had a son and she believed, presumably, in the basic reliability of the world around her, in the idea that the people closest to you were not secretly working toward your destruction. She was not naive. She was simply human. She extended the ordinary trust that ordinary life requires. The trust that makes it possible to eat dinner with someone without wondering if the food has been tampered with. The trust that makes it possible to sleep in the same house without wondering if the person in the other room has been on the dark web. She extended that trust. It was betrayed in the most extreme possible way. And the FBI sat them both down in the same room and told them both and left. That is the failure that Amy's family has never stopped naming. The statistical reality that intimate partner violence accounts for the overwhelming majority of violence against women. That when a woman is killed, the first person any competent investigator should look at is the partner. That reality was not applied in the room on May 31st, 2016, when two agents and a detective sat Amy and Stephen Allwine down together and explained the threat and then left. If it had been applied, perhaps something different would have happened. If Stephen had been separated, if the Bitcoin wallet had been subpoenaed that day, if the connection to Dog Day God had been established before Stephen had time to acquire scopolamine and a handgun, perhaps Amy would have had more time. Perhaps enough time. Perhaps not. There is no way to know. What is known is that she is dead, and that her death generated a conviction that has established legal precedent, and that the precedent will protect some future victim, in some future case, in ways that Amy's own death could not protect her. That is cold comfort. It is the kind of progress that comes at a cost that should never have had to be paid. The Brian and George story does not have even that kind of resolution. It has a ruling and a set of unanswered questions, and a father who is still asking them. It has a kill order with a Bitcoin payment and a 10-day window and a death that occurred within that window, and missing devices, and a changed life insurance beneficiary, and an unretrieved bullet, and a case that is closed. It has a young man's face in a yearbook photograph, uploaded by someone who called themselves TuneBib to a website that existed in the darkest corner of the internet. And that photograph was part of a transaction, and Brian and George died before the transaction's window closed. Those are the facts. The verdict is the verdict. The questions remain. The Besa Mafia operation, at its peak, had clients from across the United States, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. It accepted orders for murder, for assault, for kidnapping, for intimidation. It collected Bitcoin and issued reassurances and assigned fictional hitmen and made fictional progress reports and continued indefinitely, cycling through rebrands and domain changes, adapting to each disruption and returning. It was, in its own depraved way, resilient. It survived Montero's hacks. It survived the 48 hours coverage. It survived the Amy Allwine conviction. It survived multiple iterations of takedowns and rebrands. It survived for years. The Romanian arrests disrupted the network. Whether they ended it is a different question. The model was free. The model had been documented, described, analyzed, and published. Anyone who wanted to replicate it could do so. And some had. And some would. And somewhere, right now, on some .onion address on the Tor network, or in some Telegram channel, or on some encrypted platform that did not exist 3 years ago, there is a website that claims to offer murder services in exchange for cryptocurrency. There is a client composing a message. There is a photograph being uploaded. There is a Bitcoin transaction being prepared. The hitman on the other end of that transaction is probably not real. The hitman, in almost all cases, is not real. The entire dark web murder for hire economy, as an economy of actual violence, is largely fictional. The violence is the currency of the marketing. The hitmen are props. But the client is real. The desire is real. And the person whose photograph is being uploaded, who is, at this moment, somewhere in the world, doing something ordinary and human and completely unaware, is real. They have no idea. They are going about their day. They are making coffee, or driving to work, or picking up their child from school, or sitting down to dinner with the person who is, in another window on another screen, uploading their photograph and entering their address and preparing a Bitcoin transaction. They do not know. That is the thing that does not go away. That is the thing that keeps Montero at his monitors. That is the thing that made Amy Allwine's family go public with their grief and their anger and their indictment of the FBI's handling of the case. That is the thing that made Samuel and George keep asking his questions about his son's death long after the official record had been closed. The people on the list do not know they are on it. They are living in a threat they cannot see, inside a transaction they have no knowledge of, in a darkness that someone else put them in. The hitman is fake, but the list is real, and the names on it belong to people who are alive right now, going about their ordinary days, and who deserve, at a minimum, at the absolute baseline of what a just system should provide, to know that someone is watching their name, to know that someone is maintaining the alert, to know that the work is not abandoned, that the gap is being attended to, that there is at least one person in a flat in London with 6 monitors and a database and a set of Google alerts and the stubborn, unglamorous, years-long commitment to staying in the fight. His name is Chris Montero. He is a systems administrator by day and a white-hat hacker by night. He found a dark web murder website in early 2016 and wrote a blog post about it, and received a burning car video in response and decided, for reasons that he probably could not fully articulate even now, that he was not going to walk away. He has not walked away. The website was fake. The intent was real. The bodies were real. The questions were real. The man watching the list is real. And the story is not over. It will not be over until every name on that list has been accounted for, warned, or investigated, or explained, or resolved in some way that acknowledges the reality of what was done to them. Until the institutions have caught up with the technology. Until the law reflects what the evidence shows about how people use anonymity and what they do when they believe consequence is invisible. Until the gap closes. It is not closed yet, but someone is watching. Someone is always watching. And if you have been here with this story, if you have followed Brian and George and Amy Allwine and Chris Montero through all of it, If you have sat with the unanswered questions and the partial justice and the ongoing threat, then you are watching too. And that matters, because stories like this one live as long as people keep telling them. The victims on the kill list deserve to be named. The questions they leave behind deserve to be asked, loudly, by as many people as possible. The work that Montero has done in relative invisibility deserves an audience. You are that audience. Please, before you close this video, take 1 second to like it and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to understand that the dark corners of the internet are not somewhere else. They are here, they are adjacent to ordinary life, and the people they affect are not characters. They are people. They are Brian and George with his yearbook photograph. They are Amy Allwine in her church in Cottage Grove. They are every name on a list that a researcher in London is still, tonight, watching. Tell someone. Spread the word. Keep the light on this story. Because the only thing that travels faster than the model Euro built is the truth about what that model actually is. The hitman was fake. The intent was real. And sometimes, in Indiana, in Minnesota, in the early hours of a morning when someone who was on a list and didn't know it encountered something terrible, the consequences were the most real thing of all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, if it kept you up, or made you feel something, or made you think differently about the world you walk through every day, please share it. Subscribe to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, what this story meant to you, or what question you are still sitting with. I read every single one, because you deserve stories that treat you as the intelligent, thoughtful, feeling person you are. Stories that do not wrap things up cleanly when the truth is not clean. Stories that stay with the question until the question is answered. This one is not answered yet, but we are still asking it. And that is how it starts.